Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I was nearing the end of my semester at university in Chicago, and things were starting to feel like a blur. Between cramming for finals, dealing with late-night study sessions, and trying to balance a social life, the days seemed to rush by. At that point, I was just trying to survive until the semester ended, looking forward to summer when I could finally unwind and get away from the chaos of school. One afternoon, my two roommates, a hallmate, and I decided to make a trip to a neighborhood on the western side of the city. The plan was simple: take the pink line out to a spot that had an Aldi, get some cheap groceries, and head back. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just one of those mundane errands that kept life ticking along. We all met up at the train station, the usual mix of stress and casual chatter filling the air. The city was buzzing, like it always did, with a million people rushing to get to their destinations. I remember how the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows along the street. It was that awkward in-between time of the evening when the daylight is slowly giving way to the dark, and the streets start to feel a little emptier, a little more unfamiliar. We boarded the train. The seats were mostly empty, but there were a few scattered people in different parts of the car. The four of us found a spot near the back of the train and settled in, our conversations casual as we began the trip. The train started moving, and the familiar hum of the tracks underfoot provided a constant background noise. The lights of downtown slowly faded behind us, and the train veered westward, towards areas we weren't as familiar with, but we didn't mind. Aldi's was a cheap grocery haven, and we were more than willing to make the trek. As the train rattled through the city, I remember glancing around at the people in the car. There were the usual commuters, a guy buried in his phone, a couple talking in low voices, an older woman clutching her purse tightly. There was nothing out of the ordinary until the guy got on. He appeared out of nowhere, or at least it felt that way. The doors slid open at one of the stops, and in walked this man. He was tall, with ragged clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. His hair was messy, his face covered with a scruffy beard, and there was a wild look in his eyes, wide darting, like he was seeing something no one else could. He didn't sit down like everyone else. Instead, he walked to the center of the train car, facing the small crowd, and started yelling. It wasn't coherent at first. It sounded like a string of disconnected words, rambling, like someone lost their grip on reality. I could feel my pulse quicken as he raised his voice, his words becoming louder and more intense. I couldn't make out all of it, but there was something about the tone that set off alarms in my brain. The thing about city life is, you learn fast to never make eye contact with anyone who looks like they're about to snap. I'd seen enough out there to know that there were dangerous people everywhere, people who just needed a reason to go off. And this guy, he had that look. He started pacing up and down the aisles, his arms swinging dramatically with every word he screamed. It was like he was in his own world, his body movements erratic, almost exaggerated. He looked like he was acting out some kind of performance, but the fear in his voice made it clear he wasn't just putting on a show. He was unhinged, and that was the worst part. I couldn't make out what he was saying. It didn't matter. Whatever it was, it sounded like he was preparing for the end of the world. Words about destruction, chaos, and something about the apocalypse. My eyes stayed fixed ahead, my body stiff as I forced myself not to acknowledge him. I kept my focus on the window, pretending I wasn't even aware of his existence. It was a survival instinct. You don't give any stranger the satisfaction of knowing you're scared or paying attention to them. The train car felt tighter by the second. The hum of the train no longer seemed comforting. It was too loud, too jarring. The man's voice cut through it, each word sharper than the last, like he was trying to make sure everyone heard his message. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough that it was almost tangible. The other passengers looked just as uneasy as we did, though no one dared speak. Some shifted in their seats, others looked down, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or books. There were a couple of people who glanced nervously at each other, but no one moved. We all understood the same thing. Any sort of reaction might provoke him, and none of us wanted to be the one he decided to focus on. The guy didn't stop. He walked back and forth across the aisle like a man on a mission, stopping every few seconds to yell something that sent shivers up my spine. I don't even remember all the words, just the way his voice twisted with each sentence. The train felt like it was moving in slow motion. My heart was beating faster with every step he took. My hallmate, who had been sitting across from me, was clutching his backpack tightly, his knuckles white. I could see the anxiety on his face, and I could feel it rising in me too. This wasn't just some guy having a bad day. This was the kind of situation that could escalate in an instant. I had no idea what this guy was capable of, and frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. I kept telling myself that he was probably harmless, just some guy who'd lost his mind and needed help. But deep down, I knew better. People like that don't always want help. Some of them just want to bring whatever chaos is in their heads to the world around them. And in that moment, I wasn't sure what kind of person this man was. For what felt like an eternity, we all just sat there frozen, trying not to provoke him, trying not to give him any reason to turn on us. The guy didn't seem to notice our fear, or maybe he didn't care. He just kept yelling, his hands gesturing wildly, his body twitching with each word. He moved down the aisle, turned back around, then went the other way again. It was like watching a bomb tick down. And then, just like that, at the next stop, he got off. He didn't give any warning. 1 minute, he was standing there, shouting at the top of his lungs, and the next, he was gone. The doors slid open, and he simply walked off the train, disappearing into the night like he'd never been there at all. For a split second, everything was dead quiet. The train, which had been a cacophony of tension and fear, fell into a hush. You could feel the collective exhale from every single person on that train. We were all just sitting there, looking at each other, trying to process what had just happened. There were no words exchanged, no awkward laughter to break the tension. It was just pure relief. We all knew what we'd just experienced, and we all silently agreed that it was one of those moments you don't speak about. You just let it go and move on. The rest of the train ride was quiet. We all sat there, eyes forward, the hum of the tracks now oddly comforting in the absence of the man screaming. When we got off the train and walked to Aldi, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the image of that man, his wild eyes and frantic movements. I didn't know if I should feel thankful that he'd left or scared that he had disappeared so suddenly, like he was just a phantom of the city. I didn't talk much for the rest of the night, and neither did my friends. We were all just too shaken. We finished our shopping in silence, grabbing what we needed and heading back to the train. The trip back to the university was uneventful, and I remember feeling a little more on edge than usual, my mind replaying the events over and over. I kept telling myself that it was over, that nothing had happened, but the unease lingered. When I finally got back to my dorm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in the city, but in me. That moment, the fear, the helplessness, the realization that the world wasn't always as safe as we want to believe, had altered the way I looked at everything. And the next time I found myself on a late-night train in Chicago, I couldn't help but glance around, wondering if I'd ever be that person again. Just one more person in the crowd, trying not to be noticed. When I was about 13, my parents decided I was old enough to stay home alone while they went out for the night. It wasn't anything unusual for them, and I'd been left home alone plenty of times before, but this night felt different. Maybe it was because I had the whole house to myself, with no one to tell me what to do or how to do it. The house always seemed bigger when I was alone, quieter somehow. I felt a weird kind of freedom, but also a little nervous, like something was just a little off. My sister was supposed to be out with friends, and my parents weren't planning on being gone too long. They left around 10, and I told them goodbye, waving them off from the porch, not thinking much about it. It wasn't even 11 yet when I decided to call it a night. I shut off the TV, turned off my phone, and walked up to my room, trying to ignore the uncomfortable silence of the house. I kept the door open slightly, not enough to see anything, but just enough to let in a little light from the hallway. I liked it that way. It was the little things that made me feel a bit safer, like knowing my parents were just a room or two away when they were home. I slid under the covers and closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts. The stillness of the house settled over me, but as I lay there in the dark, something felt wrong. I couldn't place it, but there was a tension in the air, like everything around me was waiting for something. I heard the usual creaks and groans of the house, but this time they seemed louder, more deliberate. I rolled over, glancing at the hallway through the sliver of my bedroom door. The dim light from the bathroom flickered faintly, casting shadows that stretched across the floor. Then I heard it, a faint sound from the bottom of the stairs. At first, I thought it was my sister coming home. She liked to sneak in late, usually when Mom and Dad weren't around. She'd come up the stairs as quietly as possible to avoid waking them. But this sound wasn't like that. It was too slow, too heavy. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening harder. The noise came again, the unmistakable sound of someone stepping onto the first stair. I told myself it had to be my sister. She had to have come home early, maybe caught a ride from one of her friends. But there was something about the way the steps came, one after the other, slow and deliberate, as if the person taking them was trying to be quiet, but wasn't quite succeeding. The steps crept higher, each one dragging out longer than the last. I held my breath, listening intently, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness of the hallway. The house seemed to close in on me. The sound grew louder as the steps climbed higher. By the time the person had reached the landing, I was already sitting up in bed, my body rigid with fear. Whoever it was, they weren't moving like my sister. This wasn't the familiar sound of her sneaky steps. It was heavier, slower. Then I heard something else. A voice. A man's voice. It whispered from the darkness of the hallway, so low I could barely hear it at first. Knock, knock, knock. My blood ran cold. The voice was chilling, like it was coming from deep inside the walls, right next to me, though I couldn't see anyone. I barely even had time to process what I'd just heard before my instincts took over. I leapt out of bed, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart racing. I pressed my back against it, my hands shaking as I locked it. I barely even remembered doing it. I just had to get the door closed, had to shut out whatever that was. I could still hear the slow steps continuing up the stairs, though. But this time, they were quieter, like the person was trying to tiptoe now. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to do something. Anything, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was in a haze of panic, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Was it someone who had broken in? Was it a thief? Or worse, was it someone who was just waiting for the right moment? I sat there in the dark, pressing myself into the corner of my room, holding my breath so that I wouldn't make a sound. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the clock on the wall, because I was scared that if I did, I would see how much time had passed. But it felt like hours. My door was still shut tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just beyond it, watching, waiting. The heavy breathing of my own panic was the only sound I could hear, filling my ears like a drumbeat, drowning out everything else. Time seemed to stretch on forever, but after what felt like an eternity, I finally heard the sound of footsteps retreating. The person had reached the top of the stairs and then turned around, moving slowly back down. I didn't hear any more whispers, no more sounds of someone creeping through the house. But I wasn't going to check. I couldn't. I stayed there in the dark for what felt like another hour, just listening to the silence, waiting for any sign that it was safe to move. Finally, I heard the front door open and close softly. My heart stopped, then began to beat again, faster than before. I waited a few more minutes, just to make sure everything was calm. I didn't want to risk getting up too soon, in case whoever had been in the house was still nearby, still lurking in the shadows. It wasn't until I heard my parents' car pull into the driveway that I dared to move. I jumped up, bolted to the window, and peeked out, my heart pounding. I could see their car in the driveway, the headlights fading away as they turned off the engine. My body was still shaking, but I felt a small wave of relief wash over me. It was over. Whoever it was had gone. They were gone. The next day, I tried to tell my parents what had happened, but it didn't come out right. I kept stammering, my words tangled in my throat. I don't know if I even fully believed what I'd experienced, but I was terrified. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had been hearing things, or maybe the house had creaked in just the right way, tricking me into thinking someone was upstairs. But my sister was home by then, and when I told her what had happened, she brushed it off like it was nothing. It was probably just me, she said. I came home late last night. I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to believe her. I wanted it to be true. But something about the way she said it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like her at all. She seemed too calm, too unconcerned. I didn't push it. I didn't want to. A week later, though, she confessed. We were sitting at the kitchen table when she casually mentioned that Mom had made her say it was her who'd been on the stairs that night. She had to lie to me, make it sound like nothing had happened. She never told me why, but I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. The idea that someone had been in the house that night, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who had whispered to me from the shadows, still chilled me to my core. I was so glad when we moved. The old house never felt right after that. Even when I visited years later, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still lurking there, waiting for the night to fall so they could return. I couldn't erase the memory of that whisper, the heavy footsteps, or the feeling of being watched. It stayed with me, and I didn't talk about it much after that, but it never really left. In the end, I couldn't figure out who had been in the house that night, and I didn't care to know. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I had learned something about myself and the world around me. That there are moments when you feel safe, but that safety is just an illusion. People can be unpredictable, and the world isn't always what it seems. Whatever had happened that night, I'd never feel completely safe in that house again. It's not that I don't believe in ghosts, it's just that I've never had a reason to. I've never experienced anything that couldn't be explained away. But there's one night at my grandma's house that has stuck with me. One of those moments that's hard to shake, no matter how much I try to. Let me start with the setting. My grandma lives in the middle of nowhere, at least that's how it feels. Her house is in the heart of an orchard in Kent, surrounded by fields and trees. At night, it's as dark as pitch. There's no light pollution, no street lamps, no city glow, just a blanket of darkness that feels like it could swallow you whole. When I was younger, I used to be terrified of that darkness. The kind of fear that creeps up your spine when you're alone, when you can't see anything beyond your own hands in front of your face. But over the years, I've gotten used to it. I've stayed at her house often enough that I've stopped jumping at the smallest sounds, stopped feeling like the darkness is something that could come alive and grab me. Still, every once in a while, there are moments that test that calmness. This night was one of them. It started like any other. I arrived at my grandma's house in the evening, said hello to her and the dog, Benny, a little terrier mix who's both incredibly sweet and fiercely protective. It's the kind of dog that would bark at a leaf blowing across the yard, but in a way, that's what makes him endearing. I always found comfort in knowing Benny was there, patrolling the house and making sure no one, or nothing, got too close. That night, we all had dinner, shared stories, and by the time everything settled down, it was late. Grandma went to bed, the dog followed her upstairs, and I found myself alone in the living room. The place is cozy, with an old couch where I usually sleep when I visit. It's not much, just a sofa by the fireplace, but it's comfortable enough. The room is right next to the dining area, and that's important because of what happened next. My granddad passed away about 4 years ago. He died suddenly from an aneurysm. It was a shock, especially since it happened in the living room, just a few meters from where I was now lying on the couch. I wasn't there when it happened, but my grandma told me about it, how he just collapsed, how quickly it all happened. The memory of that night always hung in the air of the house, even if no one ever said much about it. My grandma rarely talked about it, and I respected that, but I couldn't help but think of it sometimes, especially when I was staying over. I don't know if it was the house or just the feeling of being in that spot, but every now and then I would get a sense of something. Not fear exactly, but more like a weight. A reminder, I guess. It's hard to explain. On this particular night, I'd barely gotten comfortable, the soft ticking of the old cuckoo clock in the corner, the only sound in the house. The room was dark, save for the dim glow from the fireplace and a small lamp in the corner. I wasn't asleep yet, just lying there, thinking, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. That's when Benny started acting up. At first, it was just a few whines, soft at first, like he was shifting around upstairs. But then his barking began. Not his usual yap-yap, but a frantic, desperate kind of barking. It was loud, like he was trying to get someone's attention. I thought it was strange. He never barked like that unless something was wrong. I glanced at the clock. It was about 3 in the morning. I sat up, a little disoriented, trying to figure out what was going on. Benny's barking didn't stop. It was almost like he was stuck at the top of the stairs, just pacing around, frantic and restless. It made me uneasy, though I didn't think too much of it at first. After all, he was just a dog, right? But then, the cuckoo clock went off. The sudden chirp of the bird echoed through the house, a sharp sound in the dead of night. It's an old clock, and it always makes a loud noise, but it wasn't the clock that got to me. It was the timing. The moment the cuckoo clock went off, Benny's barking intensified. It was like the two sounds were connected in some way. I couldn't explain it, but something about the combination of Benny's barking and the cuckoo clock set off a feeling in me. It was like something shifted in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. I lay back down, trying to ignore it, but that's when it happened. At first, it was subtle. A feeling. A presence. It wasn't something I could see, not at first. But it was there. It was like someone was standing behind me, just over my head. I couldn't see them, but I could feel it. An undeniable weight in the air. A pressure that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I know this sounds strange, but it wasn't just an idea. It was like the space around me had shifted, had become more solid, more real. It felt like someone was standing right behind me, close enough that I could feel their breath on my neck, their presence in the room with me. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe from being half awake. But as I lay there, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't a cold feeling, like some people describe when they talk about ghosts or spirits. It wasn't that at all. It was more like a pressure, a force that made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the air was heavier around me. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was right over my head. I could feel it so clearly that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I did, there was nothing there. Just darkness, complete and utter blackness. No shape, no figure. Just the empty, quiet room. I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense. There was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the silence of the room, the same as before. But it wasn't the same. The air felt different now. It was like the presence I had felt was still there, lingering just out of sight. The cuckoo clock had stopped. The barking had stopped. There was no sound. It was as if the house had gone completely still, as if time itself had paused for a moment. I lay back down, my heart still racing. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what happened. I don't believe in the afterlife. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. But something about that night made me question everything. I kept thinking about my granddad, how he had been there in the living room when he passed. How the house, the air itself, seemed to hold on to that moment. I'm not saying it was him, or that it was anything supernatural, but I can't shake the feeling that something changed that night. It wasn't just the barking, or the cuckoo clock, or even Benny's strange behavior. It was something else, something bigger. I don't know what it was, but I felt it. Maybe it was just the silence, the loneliness of the house in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it was the darkness. Maybe it was just the memory of my granddad still hanging around the house. But whatever it was, I can't forget that feeling of someone standing just behind me, of the air growing thick and heavy around me. It felt real, too real to ignore. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about what had happened, trying to make sense of it. But it didn't make sense. It never would. And to be honest, I don't want it to. There are some things that you can't explain, and sometimes it's better that way. Some things are better left unanswered, unspoken. The next morning, Benny was calm. The house was calm. Grandma didn't mention anything unusual. She went about her day like always, and I tried to do the same. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake it. That feeling, that presence, it stayed with me, lingering long after I left her house and went back to my own life. And even now, all these years later, I still can't make sense of it. I don't know what I felt that night, or what was behind me, or why the air felt so thick. But I know one thing for sure. That night changed something. It made me question what I thought I knew. It made me wonder about things I never considered before. And no matter how hard I try to forget it, that feeling stays with me. It's something I'll never be able to explain. I was home alone on New Year's Eve, which, to be honest, wasn't how I'd planned it. My family had left about an hour ago to visit my grandparents down south. I'd been invited to go with them, but work had insisted on me staying. They were short-staffed, and there was no way they could give me the week off to fly down with them. It felt like one of those classic bad decisions. I wanted to be with them, but instead, I was here in Ohio, alone in the house, feeling like a rebellious teenager, only older and more bitter. I was in my element, though, at least for the moment. I had a plate of bagels with spray-on cheese, despite knowing full well it would wreck my stomach. I figured, what better way to start the new year than with food that would make my intestines riot? I also knew I had a gluten and lactose intolerance, but sometimes you just gotta live on the edge. I ate like it was a last meal. Every bite of cheese on those bagels felt like rebellion, and the pain that followed was just part of the fun. The stomach grumbles started almost immediately. They were quiet at first, just a soft rumbling, like the gentle rolling of thunder in the distance. I brushed it off, focusing instead on my die-hard marathon. It was tradition. Every New Year's Eve, I watched the whole series in one sitting. I didn't care if I was the only one who appreciated Bruce Willis's one-liners. It was just me and John McClane against the world, and nothing else mattered. After a particularly epic scene where McClane drops down a vent shaft and does his usual badass one-liner, I felt the need to finally bow to nature's call. The stomach was pissed now, and there was no way around it. I got up and started making my way to the bathroom, though the sensation of urgency had me waddling a little faster than usual. I could already feel the cold sweat on my forehead, but I knew I had to make it. The storm outside had picked up, and I noticed the wind howling. The trees were swaying, casting strange shadows on the walls through the window. It didn't help that the power had flickered once already, and the lights were a bit dim. I figured it was just the storm. Power outages were pretty common in Ohio during snowstorms. Still, I felt a slight unease crawl up my spine as I opened the bathroom door. I should have known better than to ignore that gut feeling. I sat down, and just as I did, the lights flickered back on, casting an eerie glow on the bathroom tiles. Huzzah, right? Nope. Not even 3 seconds later, they flickered out again. I was sitting there, half naked, feeling the cold porcelain beneath me and knowing that my stomach was plotting against me, when I heard the first knock. Just a single tap, almost soft enough to be mistaken for the wind. But no, it was too precise, too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. It was probably just the house settling, or the wind, I thought. I dismissed it. I wasn't about to let some small sound scare me off my mission. The knocking came again, this time a little louder. Another tap, tap, then a second tap right after. Tap, tap. I felt a shiver crawl down my back, but I still didn't move. I was stuck in the bathroom with no way out. My stomach was making itself known now, and there was no turning back. But that knock, it wasn't normal. It was getting closer, or at least it felt that way. I grabbed my phone off the counter, unlocking it quickly and opening up the flashlight app. The beam of light cut through the dark, and I pointed it directly at the door. Slowly, I opened it, expecting to find nothing more than the wind throwing something against the door. But there was nothing, just the dim hallway. No one was there. No sounds. Nothing. I closed the door and took a deep breath, my heart still racing a little. I was being ridiculous, I thought. The tapping started again. It was now unmistakably louder, rhythmic, and it seemed to be in perfect sync with the beat of a song. The way it drummed against the door sent a chill straight to my bones. It was like someone was tapping their fingers, but with such precision and force that I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was too deliberate, too methodical. That's when my stomach decided to betray me in the worst possible way. A tremendous plop sounded as I let go of the pressure, and I swear I could feel the cold water of the toilet spray up against my exposed backside. My legs shot straight up in the air as if I was about to run, but instead, I just froze. My hands fumbled for my pants, pulling them up faster than I ever had in my life. I couldn't fight whatever this was if I wasn't at least semi-dressed, right? I felt embarrassed, but at the same time, my instinct to survive was kicking in. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this was. I sucked in a breath, counted to 3, and then, as if channeling some sort of ninja energy, I swung the bathroom door open wide. I prepared myself for whatever might be on the other side. Nothing. It was just the quiet hallway. The house felt too still, too silent, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stepped out, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing in on me. I checked both directions. Empty. Part of me wanted to run out of the house, call my family, do something to break the tension. But the other part, the rational, terrified part of me, told me I had unfinished business. My stomach was still gnawing at me, and I knew I couldn't let whatever this was win. So, I turned back to the bathroom. I felt like a fool, but I knew I had to finish what I started. If I didn't, I felt like I'd never get peace. I sat down again, cautiously, my eyes darting around the small bathroom. I wanted to stay focused, but that nagging feeling didn't let up. As I glanced toward the mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. Out of the corner of my eye, something was wrong. My stomach lurched, not because of the cramps, but because I realized with absolute horror that the toilet paper roll was backwards. It wasn't just that it was facing the wrong way. The way it was hanging, it was like someone had deliberately twisted it. I didn't even know how to process what I was seeing. Why would anyone, go out of their way to do something so small, so insignificant, yet so unsettling? It was as if whoever, or whatever, was messing with me had no intention of letting me live in peace. They weren't interested in making a mess or causing a scene. No, they were interested in me. They wanted me to know, to feel it. I froze. My brain didn't want to function. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The tapping, though, that was still there. The drumming of fingers against the door continued, like some phantom percussionist was out there, waiting to mess with me some more. I shut my eyes, took a deep breath, and forced myself to turn the roll back. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was my attempt at regaining control, at making it stop. For the next few days, I was in a constant state of fear. That tapping, just like the wind, just like the shadows, followed me around, haunting me at every turn. I could hear it when I was in the kitchen, in the living room, even when I went to bed at night. My brain convinced me that it wasn't just the house creaking, that it wasn't just the wind. No, something was deliberate about it. Something wasn't right. The house fell off. It wasn't until my family returned that everything returned to normal. The tapping stopped. The unease lifted. The lights were steady again. The toilet paper was back in its place, and I could breathe without feeling like I was on edge. But I knew. I'd never forget how it felt to sit there in that cold, dim-lit bathroom, trying to ignore that someone was playing with me. No one would ever believe what happened, but I knew. I knew that something had been watching. Something had been waiting. And no, it wasn't a ghost or some creepy figure. It was something much more real, something just as terrifying in its own way. That was the last time I ever let myself feel comfortable in that house alone again. I was at school in New York City, living in one of the most bizarre dorm buildings you could imagine. The thing had a history as long as the city itself, and not exactly a pleasant one. The place had been a hotel, an apartment building, and going way back, even a brothel. At least that's what I'd heard from older students and some of the faculty who liked to share these stories like they were gossip. People who lived there for a while would tell you that it was a strange place, with strange things happening. But after a while, I just tried to ignore it. The dorms were the dorms. You had to live there, and it was better than paying the insane rent for a place in Manhattan. Still, the whole old building with a history thing never really sat well with me. There were some weird details that came with the building's age. First of all, it had these leftover tenants, old people who'd been living there long before the school bought the building out and turned it into dorms. I think the school couldn't get them to leave, or maybe they just couldn't afford to evict them, so there were a few old residents mixed in with the college kids. Some of them were nice, but others were not so much. There was this one guy, Paul, who was always the subject of rumors. He was a man in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, always shouting at people who weren't there. He lived on one of the floors where the older residents hung out. I'd heard stories that he talked to himself at night, or screamed at random hours, and even though I'd never had a personal encounter with him, I could never shake the weird feeling that something wasn't right with him. You could hear him shouting sometimes, his voice echoing in the building late at night. I don't think anyone ever really understood him. And honestly, I didn't care to. There was enough going on in the building without trying to figure him out. Now, let's get to the part of the story that still freaks me out, even though it's been years since it happened. One night, I was in my tiny dorm room, the same 8x10 room I'd been living in for a while. It wasn't much, just a single bed, a desk, and a bathroom tucked behind a door next to my bed. The walls were thin, the window overlooked a street lit up by the never-ending glow of city lights, and the sound of cars honking or people shouting seemed to seep into every corner. I should have been used to it by then, but that night I couldn't sleep. I wasn't sure if it was the heat in the room or the sound of traffic, but I couldn't get comfortable. The bed felt too small, the air too still. My mind wandered, and I could feel my thoughts drifting in strange directions, like I was still half awake, but also half dreaming. It wasn't long before the dream started to take over. It was one of those vivid, weird ones where you can't really tell what's real and what's part of the dream. I remember feeling like I was in my bed, but it wasn't just a dream of my room anymore. It felt like the room was changing around me. 1 second, The familiar outline of my bed was in place. The next, it was like I could almost feel a presence hovering over me. The air felt thick, heavy, like someone was standing right next to me, breathing down my neck. That's when it started. The sound of breathing. Deep, heavy, almost as if someone was standing just behind my head. The kind of breath that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I tried to turn, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I was paralyzed. I could feel the pressure of someone, or something, looming above me. And it wasn't just the sensation, I could actually hear it. This huge, slow inhale, followed by a long exhale, right by my ear. The kind of breath that you could feel in your chest, a real physical presence. But when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. I could barely breathe, my throat tight with panic, but I still couldn't move. Every part of me was screaming to get up, but my body just wouldn't listen. I remember trying to squirm in the bed, but it felt like I was trapped in my own skin, my muscles stiff, unwilling to obey my brain. Then there was a flash, just a quick one, like a light flickered through the room, maybe from the street outside. But it felt like the dream was pressing in even harder. The air thickened, and I could feel it again. The breathing, the presence hovering right there. It was in that moment I had this flash, this bizarre feeling that someone, had walked out of the room. Not in a natural way, though more like in a blur, like I was seeing the movement in slow motion. In the strange dream state I was in, I pictured this hulking figure, a shadow of a man, stepping out of my room, walking toward the door. But the strange thing was, in my half-dream, I saw him walk out the front door of my dorm room, and then enter through the bathroom door. I'm not sure if it was just the confusion of the half-dream, but it didn't make sense. The bathroom door was locked. There was no way anyone could get in that way without making noise, and the whole thing felt physically impossible. But there I was, in the middle of this nightmare, watching it unfold in what seemed like real time, as if someone had slipped through the cracks of reality itself. And then, without warning, everything snapped back. I woke up. For real. I was sitting in my bed, heart racing, still feeling the echo of the heavy breath in my ears, still hearing the remnants of that disturbing sound in the air. But when I looked around, my room was empty. Silent. But that's when the door creaked. It was so slow, so soft, but unmistakable. The bathroom door, closed just moments before, opened, ever so slightly. It wasn't enough to be a draft, and it wasn't some random malfunction in the building. No, I could feel it. Someone, or something, had opened that door. I don't know why, but I felt the blood drain from my face as I sat there, frozen in bed. I stared at the bathroom door, my breath shallow. It was still dark outside, the only light coming from the street lamps through my window. The door stayed cracked open, just an inch, but it might as well have been a mile. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it Paul? Had he somehow gotten into my room? Was it just a bad dream, playing tricks on me? I couldn't stand it anymore. I threw off the covers, grabbed my phone from the nightstand, and stumbled out of bed. The room felt too small now, too confining. I looked around once more, as if expecting someone to pop out of the shadows, but the room was empty. The door was open. I don't know why I didn't call anyone. Maybe I was too embarrassed, or maybe I just didn't want to sound insane. But I wasn't staying in that room for another minute. I grabbed my jacket, threw it on, and bolted out of the dorm room, running down the stairs to the street below. The night air hit me like a slap, but it was refreshing. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away from that damn dorm. I ended up at a diner down the block that stayed open all night. The lights inside were bright, the coffee strong, and the place was almost empty, except for a few other late-night stragglers. I sat at the counter, trying to shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something from that room had followed me down the street. But as the minutes passed, and I started sipping my coffee, I slowly started to calm down. It didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation for the bathroom door creaking open. No explanation for the feeling of someone standing over me. Maybe it was all a hallucination, a weird combination of a dream and reality that tangled together. But whatever it was, I knew I wasn't going back to that room anytime soon. The rest of the night passed quietly, and when I finally went back to the dorm, I didn't dare open that bathroom door again. I stayed out for as long as I could, even if it meant skipping class the next morning. Something about that night, about the door opening when it shouldn't have, stayed with me. And to this day, I still don't have a good explanation for it. Was it Paul? Maybe. Or maybe it was something else. Something that didn't belong in a dorm full of college kids. But whatever it was, I learned to never fully trust that building again. In the end, I guess that's what happens when you live in a place that's seen so many things, from hotel guests to brothel workers to those strange old tenants. Some parts of it just refuse to leave, even after all these years. The night my grandmother died, I was too young to really grasp the weight of it. I don't even remember how old I was, maybe 7 or 8, but it was one of those moments in life that marks you, even if you can't put into words exactly how it feels at the time. I was just a kid, and loss was something I hadn't yet experienced. My brother and I were at home when the call came, loud and frantic. I can still hear the voice of my grandmother's husband, not my grandfather, but her second husband, screaming into the phone. He was crying, and even though I didn't know exactly what was going on, I could feel the heaviness in the air. The adults were crying too, and as kids, we didn't understand what was happening, but it felt like the world was about to shift. We didn't really know who had passed until much later. We were just crying because everyone else was. In my young mind, it was like an instinct. You just mimicked what the grown-ups were doing, even though you had no real understanding of why. The atmosphere around us changed after that night. It was like the air was thicker, colder. I don't remember much about that night except the overwhelming sense of sadness and confusion, but I remember my mother's bedroom clearly. I was in there with her that night, lying in bed because I was sad and scared. The room felt colder than usual, and I crawled under the covers next to her, hoping the warmth would make the sadness go away. The dim light from a small lamp in the corner cast strange, faint shadows on the walls. It was so quiet that even the sound of my own breathing seemed loud in my ears. I was looking at the wall, not really thinking about anything in particular, when I saw something odd. It wasn't a real person. It was like a blurry figure, almost like a smudge on the wall, moving slowly across the surface. It was a man, though not in the sense that you could make out every detail. He was blurry, like the focus on an old movie projector was just slightly off, making his features fade in and out. He was wearing red and white striped pajamas, the kind you'd imagine a grandfather wearing. The pajamas were so vivid, but the rest of him just wasn't. He walked slowly, with an almost lazy gait, like he didn't have anywhere to be, but still had purpose in his movements. He walked across the wall, and when he reached the chair that was standing against the wall in my mom's room, he sat down, his body melting into the chair, as though he was part of it. And then just like that, he disappeared. I don't think I said anything. I just stared at the spot where he had been, feeling a chill creep through me that I couldn't shake. My mother didn't say anything either, at least not at first. She just sat up, her eyes wide, as if she had seen something she wasn't expecting. And then, without turning to look at me, she whispered, almost to herself, "It's your grandfather. He's here, looking for Grammy." The words didn't make sense to me, not fully. It was one of those things that kids don't understand, but even in my confusion, I felt a deep, deep fear. My whole body went cold. I was stiff, unable to move. I couldn't even look away. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The room felt colder still, and I could barely breathe as I lay there, staring at the wall. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I couldn't bring myself to speak about it. It didn't feel like a memory I could touch, just a vague sense of something that happened, but didn't feel real, like a dream that had gotten tangled up with reality. A few nights after that, I was sitting alone in the living room on the couch. My parents weren't home, and the house felt oddly still. It was the middle of the night, and all the lights were off except for a small, dim one in the hallway. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone, though the house was completely quiet. I couldn't place it, but I felt like I was being watched. There was this weight in the air, and the coldness from the night my grandmother had passed came back, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. Without thinking, my eyes turned to the hallway, and there, at the very end, was a figure. He was standing in the shadows, just outside of the reach of the faint light. He was a man, tall and dressed in a suit from the 1930s or 1940s, complete with a fedora. He held a cane in front of him, just standing there like he was waiting for something. His face wasn't clear, but I could see enough to know that he was glaring at me. His eyes were dark, and there was something about the way he stood that made my stomach drop. He didn't move. He just stared at me, his mouth stretched into a thin black slit that grew wider, until it seemed to swallow the rest of his face. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I was frozen, unable to blink or breathe. Time felt like it was standing still, like the entire world had gone silent, and there was only this man in the hallway, staring. The blackness of his face seemed to stretch outward, swallowing the hallway and the light, until the end of the corridor was nothing but cold, black emptiness. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but when I blinked again, he was gone. The hallway was empty, just as it should have been. But I was still frozen, staring at the spot where he had been, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't remember much after that. I just remember waking up in my bed the next morning, as though nothing had happened, as though I had fallen asleep and dreamed the entire thing. But I knew deep down that it hadn't been a dream. The memory of that man standing at the end of the hall, his face stretching into that dark void, stayed with me, gnawing at me for years. As I grew older, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease whenever I thought about that house. I couldn't even drive by it without getting that cold, tight feeling in my chest. It was as though the house still held on to something that wouldn't let go. Every time I passed by it, I could feel the air thicken again, that same heaviness, as though I was being watched. Sometimes I think back to the night my grandmother died and wonder if it all was just coincidence, just the strange workings of a child's imagination. But no matter how hard I try to rationalize it, I can't explain the feeling of being trapped, the cold that gripped me, or the figure that stood at the end of the hallway. Even now, as an adult, I still don't fully understand what I saw that night. Was it real? Was it a dream? I don't know. But the fear I felt that night was real, and I've never quite been able to forget it. I don't go near that house anymore. It's still there, standing on that same street, and I still can't bring myself to look at it for long. I don't know what happened, or what that man was, but the feeling of coldness and fear has never left me. There's something about that place that I'll never understand, and I don't think I ever want to. Some things are better left buried, and some places are better left undisturbed. Maybe I'll never know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, or maybe it was something I wasn't meant to understand. But whatever it was, I'm not in a hurry to find out. When my grandfather passed away in 2007, I didn't get to go to his funeral. I was so sick at the time, I could barely get out of bed. My parents decided to go out of town to see him before he passed, and they left me at home alone since my sisters were at school. I was supposed to rest and recover, but honestly, I didn't feel like doing much. The fever had me sweating, my body ached, and I couldn't hold any food down. It felt like I was about to die myself. I spent most of the day in bed, under the covers, trying to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach. The TV was on, and I was half watching Maury. You know the show. It's full of those wild paternity test reveals. That show always seemed to pass the time when I was too tired to care about anything else. The house was still and quiet except for the occasional flicker of static from the TV and the soft hum of the ceiling fan above me. It felt like I was the only one in the world. Then I heard it. At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just the TV. A soft cry. Not like a grown person crying, but a baby's cry. It was distant, almost muffled. I thought it was just part of the show, or maybe my fever was playing tricks on me. I ignored it and kept watching, trying to focus on Maury's dramatic reveals. But then it happened again. A soft, distant cry that almost seemed to echo from somewhere far off in the house. My eyes shifted to the doorway, but everything was normal. The house was still. At that point, I sat up in bed, feeling a little uneasy. It couldn't be my parents, they were out of town. My sisters weren't home either, so it couldn't be them. I told myself it was just my imagination, the fever messing with me. But then, the cry came again, a little louder this time, and I could have sworn it was coming from somewhere closer. My heart started to race. I sat there, frozen for a moment, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The room felt hotter, the air thick with unease. I got up, my legs shaky from the fever, and slowly walked toward the sound. The house was empty, but the cry seemed to be real. It sounded almost like a newborn, the kind of sound that you only hear in the early morning hours. It felt strange, like it didn't belong. The cry stopped abruptly, but the unease lingered. I stood in the hallway for a minute, listening. There was no sound, just the distant hum of the TV. I thought maybe it was the wind, or maybe the neighbors were outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. I turned off the TV, hoping the silence would help me make sense of it all. But as soon as the sound of the TV went off, I heard it again. Only this time, it was definitely coming from my mom's room. The faint cry echoed through the walls, a soft, desperate sound that made my stomach twist. I stood there, not sure what to do. I was sick, exhausted, and a little scared, but I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I slowly walked down the hallway toward my mom's room, my footsteps heavy on the floorboards. As I approached the door, I noticed that it was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling out from the crack. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was dark, but the light from the hallway spilled in just enough for me to make out the crib by the window. My mom had always kept it in there, even though my sisters were older by then. She had kept it for babysitting my older sister's kids, and I remembered the little mattress, the soft blankets, and the stuffed animals. It had been so long since I'd seen it, but it felt like it was just waiting for a baby to return. As I walked into the room, I could hear the faint sound of a baby's cry again, coming from the crib. It was so real, so vivid. I paused, my heart pounding harder. There was no baby here. I was alone in the house. I shouldn't have heard that sound. I walked a little closer, my eyes glued to the crib. The faint sounds of a baby struggling, sniffling, just like the kind of noise a newborn would make when it was upset, kept coming from the corner. I was frozen for a moment, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but it felt too real to ignore. My breath quickened, and I couldn't stop the chill that ran down my spine. Then, there was a sharp sound. Something falling. A crash. I turned toward the dresser in the corner of the room and saw it. The photo of my mom and my grandma that had been sitting there for years. The old wooden frame had fallen off the dresser and shattered on the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. It was too much. My fever was already making everything feel strange, but this felt like something I couldn't explain. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The baby's cry, the photo falling. It felt like a sign, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. It was like the whole room had suddenly shifted, like the air had thickened around me. I ran out of the room, my feet stumbling as I made my way down the hallway. I didn't stop to think, I just moved. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the front door and ran outside. The cool evening air hit me, but I didn't stop. I kept running, not caring about the fever, not caring about anything except getting out of that house. I ran next door to my older sister's house, not even bothering to knock. I just pushed the door open and rushed inside. My sister was on the phone, talking softly in the kitchen, and I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself down. I wanted to tell her what I'd just heard, but she was still on the phone, so I waited. The minutes felt like hours as I stood there, shaking. When she finally hung up, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told her everything, the cries, the photo falling, the feeling of being watched. She just stared at me for a moment, like she didn't know what to say. It felt like I had just told her something too strange to believe. Then she spoke. Grandpa just died, like 5 minutes ago. The words hit me like a wave. I couldn't breathe for a second. Everything I had felt, everything that had happened in that house, it all clicked. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my bones. The timing, the crying baby, the photo falling. It was too much to be just a coincidence. It was like something in me knew, even before I understood. I stood there, frozen, as my sister's words sank in. My grandfather had passed away just as I was experiencing that moment. There was no explanation for it, no rational reason for the fear I had felt, no way to make sense of what had happened in that room. But somehow, in the silence of that moment, everything made sense. It wasn't about ghosts or spirits or any kind of supernatural force. It was about something deeper, a connection, an instinct, a feeling that I couldn't put into words. I couldn't explain the baby's cry or the falling photo, but I knew what I had felt. In that moment, I understood that there are things in life that don't need explanations, things that happen whether we understand them or not. I didn't need to know why it happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been a moment of closure, a sign that my grandfather had passed, and somehow I had felt it. My sister gave me a hug, but I wasn't sure what to say. We didn't need to talk about it anymore. It didn't matter. The strange moment in the house was over, but the memory of it, the feeling, stayed with me. I never forgot that day. I don't know what it was, but I know it was real. Sometimes there are things that happen in life that you can't explain, but they're still important. That day, I felt a connection to something greater than myself, something that went beyond reason or understanding, and I never forgot it. I remember it like it was yesterday. The chill of the evening air, the quiet hum of crickets, the rustling of the leaves, and the way the darkness seemed to stretch farther than usual that night. My brother and I had always played hide and seek with our neighborhood friends, Zach and Levi. Our front yard was the perfect setting. It was big enough to hide in, and the trees, fences, and bushes gave us plenty of places to duck behind. The streetlights didn't shine all that brightly, and the darkness seemed more comforting than threatening back then. We were no strangers to playing outside after dark. In fact, it had become something of a ritual for us. We'd run around in the half-dark, laughing and yelling, running behind trees and bushes, trying to be the first to find a perfect hiding spot. We'd play until our parents called us in, usually after a couple of hours. But this night, everything changed. I was that night, standing at the base of the old oak tree in the middle of our front yard while my brother, Zach, and Levi scurried off to hide. They both liked to pick spots close to the corner of the yard, right by the intersection of our road and the neighborhood road. It was a perfect spot to hide because from there, they could see cars coming and go unnoticed by anyone passing by. I could always count on them to pick that corner, so I didn't think much of it when they ran off that way. I began my countdown, my voice bouncing around the quiet yard. It wasn't long before I finished counting to 100, my eyes opening wide, scanning the yard for the first signs of movement. I started to walk, searching the usual places, behind the big tree, under the porch, near the old garden shed, but the whole yard felt eerily empty. The usual sounds of the night felt different. There was no laughter, no noise, just the breeze and the faint hum of something distant. I hadn't even realized that a car had pulled up to the intersection until it was right in front of me. The headlights cut through the darkness, making the whole street glow for a moment, like it had been illuminated by a huge spotlight. The car slowed to a stop near the corner of our yard, right where Zach and Levi had been hiding. It didn't stay there long. The headlights glared for a second before it crept forward again, turning onto the next corner where Levi had been hiding. I noticed it slowed again, like it was checking the area, taking its time. The car didn't speed up or make any noise. It just moved slowly, quietly, almost deliberately. It felt strange, like the driver was making sure no one was around, or maybe making sure that we were all still out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the car moved out of sight, disappearing around the curve of the road. I was about to head toward Zach and Levi when I heard the faint sound of feet running, fast. My brother and Levi came rushing toward me from opposite directions. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with panic. "We need to get inside." "Now," Zach said, his voice shaky. Levi was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around, but his words came out as a quick whisper. There was something wrong with that car. I think it was the driver. We heard a gun cocking when it stopped. I didn't know what to think. I figured maybe they were just freaked out. The car had been driving unusually slow, and it had stopped by their hiding spots for a second too long, but I didn't think it was that big a deal. People often drove by slowly in our neighborhood, especially if they weren't familiar with the roads. I tried to brush it off as just a coincidence, but then I heard it, the sharp, unmistakable sound of 2 gunshots in the distance. The sound echoed in the air, and I froze. It wasn't a car backfiring or a fireworks show. It was gunshots. I didn't know how to react. My heart started pounding, and without thinking, my legs started moving, carrying me toward the safety of the house. My brother and Levi were right behind me, and we rushed into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. I was breathless, my mind racing, but still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Gunshots. A car stopping by our yard? It was too much, too sudden, and none of it made any sense. Inside, we all stood there, unsure of what to do next. My brother and Levi were shaking, their faces still pale with fear. We sat down on the couch, trying to calm ourselves, but it wasn't working. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, and the images of the car slowing down and the sound of the gunshots kept replaying in my mind. The night had gone from a simple game of hide and seek to something far more terrifying, and none of us knew how to process it. After a while, Levi's parents arrived to pick him up. I think they could tell something was wrong by the way he looked, disheveled and shaken. Zach and I didn't say much to our parents that night. They thought we were just tired, but we weren't. We were scared, too scared to explain what had just happened. The next day, my dad, Zach, and I went for a walk down the road toward the area where the gunshots had been fired. I think my dad just wanted to make sure everything was okay, maybe hoping that it was all some sort of misunderstanding. But when we got to the spot where we'd heard the shots, we found something that made my stomach drop. There, right by the side of the road, were two shiny bullet shells left behind in the grass. We didn't touch them. My dad just stood there, looking at them for a long time. I could tell he was trying to make sense of it too, but he didn't say anything. For a long time after that night, Zach and I didn't play outside after dark. We were both too freaked out to go near the corner of our yard, and the thought of another car driving by slowly made our stomachs churn. The feeling of being watched lingered for weeks. It wasn't just the fear of what we had heard or what had happened. It was the sense of vulnerability, of not knowing who was out there, or why they were watching us in the first place. My parents didn't seem to understand why we were so shaken. They thought it was just a strange coincidence, something that wasn't a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But we knew better. We had heard the gunshots, seen the car, and found the bullets. It wasn't just some freak incident. Something had been wrong that night. We never found out who was in that car or what they were doing, but we never forgot the feeling of dread that washed over us when it stopped near our corner, and we never played outside after dark again. And to this day, I still don't know what the driver wanted or why he had a gun. I don't know if they were just messing with us, or if something worse could have happened. I never told anyone else about that night. Maybe they wouldn't believe me, or maybe I didn't want to revisit it, but I always wonder what could have happened if we hadn't run back into the house that night. I don't know if it was the exhaustion from driving for hours or just the feeling of being far from home, but when I stopped at the sleep-in in Auburn, Alabama, everything felt normal at first. It was about halfway through my journey from Louisiana to North Carolina, and I figured I'd get some rest, then hit the road again the next morning. The hotel looked like any other budget place you'd stop at when you're too tired to care about much else. I checked in, got my key, and found my room on the 3rd floor. The room was exactly what I expected. A bed, desk, TV, small sofa, and a bathroom. Nothing fancy, just your typical roadside hotel room. I tossed my bags on the bed, plugged in my laptop, and opened up to chat with a friend. We talked about movies, and I remember mentioning how creepy Paranormal Activity was. We laughed about it, joked about how scary the sounds in the movie were, and how freaked out I'd been watching it alone. Little did I know, I'd be experiencing something that night that was far more unsettling than anything that happened in the movie. After a while, I settled down on the sofa with my laptop, letting Nathan Fillion and the 2nd season of Castle distract me. I needed a good, lighthearted show to take my mind off the long drive. Everything was calm. The hotel was quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I felt a little bit of relief, the kind you get when you know you're far from home, but still safely in a bed, and the world feels a little more manageable for a while. Then I heard it. A faint noise, like metal clinking together. It came from the bathroom. It wasn't loud, just a soft clink, like something was being dropped or moved around. I figured it was just the pipes, or maybe a neighbor's room. I tried to ignore it and kept watching Castle. But then I heard it again. Clink, clink. This time, it was louder, more pronounced. I froze. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe something had fallen. Whatever it was, it didn't seem too weird. I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. So, I turned my attention back to the show, trying to focus. But that noise, it kept coming back. Another clink, another one, and then the TV flickered. The screen turned on. The end credits of some random movie were flashing. I hadn't touched the remote. In fact, the remote was still sitting on top of the TV. My stomach dropped a little. I wasn't sure what to think, but I definitely didn't think I had just somehow accidentally sat on the remote, turning the TV on. I got up slowly, moved to the TV, and turned it off. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, though. It was like the room had shifted slightly, and I was more aware of everything. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was an electrical issue, a faulty TV, a glitch. I sat back on the sofa, trying to get my thoughts straight. But deep down, I couldn't stop feeling uneasy. I grabbed my laptop again, hoping to distract myself. I didn't want to feel scared, not over something so stupid, but there it was, a creeping anxiety that wouldn't let go. And then I heard it again. Clink, clink, clink. I wasn't imagining it this time. The noise was unmistakably coming from my bathroom. I shot up from the sofa. My heart was beating faster now, and my mouth was dry. This wasn't just a random noise. I walked slowly to the bathroom, my mind racing. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and the light from the hallway illuminated the tub. I walked in, and that's when I saw it. The bathtub was running. The water was streaming, filling the tub with a steady rush of water, and I hadn't turned it on. My head spun. I immediately reached over and turned the faucet off, staring at the small ripples in the water. My eyes scanned the room. Nothing. No explanation. I stood there for a while, just staring at the tub. It didn't make sense. Who would have turned it on? Why? I walked out of the bathroom, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had been messing with me. Maybe it was just one of those weird coincidences that happen sometimes. I sat back on the bed, trying to calm down. But I wasn't calm. Not at all. I picked up the phone beside the bed, my hands shaking slightly. I had to call the front desk. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything weird. Maybe there was an explanation, something I hadn't thought of. I dialed the number. It rang. Then the phone went dead. Static. That's all I could hear. It was like the call had been cut off by something, like the entire signal had been corrupted. I tried to speak into the receiver, but it was just a garbled mess of noise. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted, and then the line went silent. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. This was too weird. I wasn't staying in that room any longer. I grabbed my key and ran downstairs to the lobby. The front desk was quiet, the receptionist sitting there, looking up at me as I approached. I didn't waste time. I started explaining what had happened. The noises, the TV turning on, the faucet running. But I couldn't get a read on her. She just stared at me, blank-faced, and then she started laughing. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was more like a nervous, uneasy laugh. She tried to hold it in, but it came out in bursts. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking a little. "I'm sorry, but this has just never happened before." I didn't find it funny. I didn't think it was funny at all. I asked if anyone else had reported anything similar, but she just shook her head. I wasn't buying it, though. Something was off. She offered me another room on the same floor. I wasn't going for that. I didn't want to be anywhere near that room. So, she offered me a room on the 4th floor instead. I took the key and went up to the 4th floor, almost feeling like I was running away from something. As I made my way to the elevator, I passed a teenager who was too busy on her phone to notice me. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, but the further I went from my old room, the worse it felt. I reached my new room, and everything seemed fine at first. No weird noises, no flickering lights. But as I was unpacking my stuff, I heard it again. A click. A soft, almost imperceptible click from the refrigerator. At first, I thought it was just the usual hum of a hotel fridge. But as I listened more closely, I realized it was something different. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a sound, a rhythmic clicking that seemed deliberate. I tried to ignore it. By the time I left the hotel the next morning, I was ready to get the hell out of Auburn. The drive to North Carolina felt endless. I never thought about the sleep-in again, at least not consciously. Months later, I was cleaning through some old receipts I'd stuffed in my glove compartment, and I found the one from that night. The address was the same, but there was one thing that stood out. The hotel was located on Spirit Drive. I don't know if it was the exhaustion, the weirdness, or my mind playing tricks, but I've never felt comfortable staying at a hotel in the middle of nowhere since. I don't know if it was the exhaustion from driving for hours or just the feeling of being far from home, but when I stopped at the sleep-in in Auburn, Alabama, everything felt normal at first. It was about halfway through my journey from Louisiana to North Carolina, and I figured I'd get some rest, then hit the road again the next morning. The hotel looked like any other budget place you'd stop at when you're too tired to care about much else. I checked in, got my key, and found my room on the 3rd floor. The room was exactly what I expected. A bed, desk, TV, small sofa, and a bathroom. Nothing fancy, just your typical roadside hotel room. I tossed my bags on the bed, plugged in my laptop, and opened up to chat with a friend. We talked about movies, and I remember mentioning how creepy Paranormal Activity was. We laughed about it, joked about how scary the sounds in the movie were, and how freaked out I'd been watching it alone. Little did I know, I'd be experiencing something that night that was far more unsettling than anything that happened in the movie. After a while, I settled down on the sofa with my laptop, letting Nathan Fillion, and the second season of Castle distract me. I needed a good, lighthearted show to take my mind off the long drive. Everything was calm. The hotel was quiet, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I felt a little bit of relief, the kind you get when you know you're far from home, but still safely in a bed, and the world feels a little more manageable for a while. Then I heard it, a faint noise, like metal clinking together. It came from the bathroom. It wasn't loud, just a soft clink, like something was being dropped or moved around. I figured it was just the pipes, or maybe a neighbor's room. I tried to ignore it and kept watching Castle. But then I heard it again. Clink, clink. This time, it was louder, more pronounced. I froze. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe something had fallen. Whatever it was, it didn't seem too weird. I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. So, I turned my attention back to the show, trying to focus. But that noise, it kept coming back. Another clink, another one, and then the TV flickered. The screen turned on. The end credits of some random movie were flashing. I hadn't touched the remote. In fact, the remote was still sitting on top of the TV. My stomach dropped a little. I wasn't sure what to think, but I definitely didn't think I had just somehow accidentally sat on the remote, turning the TV on. I got up slowly, moved to the TV, and turned it off. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, though. It was like the room had shifted slightly, and I was more aware of everything. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was an electrical issue, a faulty TV, a glitch. I sat back on the sofa, trying to get my thoughts straight. But deep down, I couldn't stop feeling uneasy. I grabbed my laptop again, hoping to distract myself. I didn't want to feel scared, not over something so stupid, but there it was, a creeping anxiety that wouldn't let go. And then I heard it again. Clink, clink, clink. I wasn't imagining it this time. The noise was unmistakably coming from my bathroom. I shot up from the sofa. My heart was beating faster now, and my mouth was dry. This wasn't just a random noise. I walked slowly to the bathroom, my mind racing. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and the light from the hallway illuminated the tub. I walked in, and that's when I saw it. The bathtub was running. The water was streaming, filling the tub with a steady rush of water, and I hadn't turned it on. My head spun. I immediately reached over and turned the faucet off, staring at the small ripples in the water. My eyes scanned the room. Nothing. No explanation. I stood there for a while, just staring at the tub. It didn't make sense. Who would have turned it on? Why? I walked out of the bathroom, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had been messing with me. Maybe it was just one of those weird coincidences that happen sometimes. I sat back on the bed, trying to calm down. But I wasn't calm. Not at all. I picked up the phone beside the bed, my hands shaking slightly. I had to call the front desk. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything weird. Maybe there was an explanation, something I hadn't thought of. I dialed the number. It rang. Then the phone went dead. Static. That's all I could hear. It was like the call had been cut off by something, like the entire signal had been corrupted. I tried to speak into the receiver, but it was just a garbled mess of noise. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted, and then the line went silent. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. This was too weird. I wasn't staying in that room any longer. I grabbed my key and ran downstairs to the lobby. The front desk was quiet, the receptionist sitting there, looking up at me as I approached. I didn't waste time. I started explaining what had happened. The noises, the TV turning on, the faucet running. But I couldn't get a read on her. She just stared at me, blank-faced, and then she started laughing. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was more like a nervous, uneasy laugh. She tried to hold it in, but it came out in bursts. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking a little. "I'm sorry, but this has just never happened before." I didn't find it funny. I didn't think it was funny at all. I asked if anyone else had reported anything similar, but she just shook her head. I wasn't buying it, though. Something was off. She offered me another room on the same floor. I wasn't going for that. I didn't want to be anywhere near that room. So, she offered me a room on the 4th floor instead. I took the key and went up to the 4th floor, almost feeling like I was running away from something. As I made my way to the elevator, I passed a teenager who was too busy on her phone to notice me. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, but the further I went from my old room, the worse it felt. I reached my new room, and everything seemed fine at first. No weird noises, no flickering lights. But as I was unpacking my stuff, I heard it again. A click. A soft, almost imperceptible click from the refrigerator. At first, I thought it was just the usual hum of a hotel fridge. But as I listened more closely, I realized it was something different. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a sound, a rhythmic clicking that seemed deliberate. I tried to ignore it. By the time I left the hotel the next morning, I was ready to get the hell out of Auburn. The drive to North Carolina felt endless. I never thought about the sleep-in again, at least not consciously. Months later, I was cleaning through some old receipts I'd stuffed in my glove compartment, and I found the one from that night. The address was the same, but there was one thing that stood out. The hotel was located on Spirit Drive. I don't know if it was the exhaustion, the weirdness, or my mind playing tricks, but I've never felt comfortable staying at a hotel in the middle of nowhere since. I grew up in an old cottage that was built around 1890. The house had that deep, creaky character that only old buildings can have. The walls had stories in them, and the floors seemed to have a life of their own, shifting and creaking with every step. It wasn't just the house that was old. It felt like the air itself had been there for ages, thick with history. We moved into the cottage when I was young, and it quickly became my childhood home. My parents loved the place, despite its quirks, and over the years, I learned to accept the odd sounds and strange creaks that seemed to come from nowhere. It was 1995 when my parents decided to renovate the house. We were going to update the old kitchen, modernize the bathrooms, and most significantly, move the staircase. I was used to the old staircase by then, the one that had been there as long as I could remember, winding up from the hallway with 13 steps and a little door at the top. The door was small and always seemed out of place, like it was hiding something, though I never dared to open it. It was just part of the mystery of the place. But when the renovation started, they dismantled the staircase completely. They moved it to a different part of the house, and the new staircase had only 12 steps. At first, I didn't think much of it. The house was always in a state of change. My parents had always talked about doing something to the place, and now they were finally getting around to it. But after the old staircase was gone, that's when the weird things started happening. The house was still full of its usual noises. Old houses are like that, aren't they? The walls creak, the floors groan underfoot, the pipes rattle in the walls when the water's running. But there was something different about it now. We started hearing noises at night, soft at first, but gradually they became louder. Footsteps, faint but distinct. 13 steps. 13 steps and a door closing. It wasn't just my imagination. I wasn't the only one who heard it. My parents did too, though they never spoke much of it. But I could hear it clear as day. Someone walking up the old staircase. I remember one night, lying in my bed. The sound seemed louder than usual. Thump, thump, thump. The steps came, followed by the sound of a door closing softly. I froze, wide awake, my heart thudding in my chest. I knew the staircase was gone. It had been dismantled, removed. There was no way anyone could be walking up it. But the sound was real, and it wasn't stopping. I kept my eyes tightly shut, trying to ignore the sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still using that old staircase. The creak of the wood was unmistakable, the old steps groaning, as if being used again after years of silence. Over time, I became accustomed to it, or at least I tried to, but it never quite stopped bothering me. The weirdest thing was that no one else seemed to be as affected by it as I was. My parents didn't talk about the noises, and my sister, who shared a bunk bed with me, never mentioned hearing anything strange. But I couldn't ignore it. It felt like the house itself was holding on to something. Something from before the renovation. Something from the past that didn't want to be forgotten. Then, there was another incident. One night, I woke up and found that my sister wasn't in her bed. We had bunk beds, and I always felt comforted by the sound of her breathing beside me. But now there was nothing. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and called out to her. When she didn't answer, I slid out of bed, feeling the chill of the night air as I stepped onto the cold floor. I walked out of the room, thinking she might have gone to our parents' bedroom or to the bathroom. But when I passed by their room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My mom and sister were sitting in my mom's bed, both of them wide-eyed and staring at me. They looked terrified, and before I could say a word, they both screamed at me to stop, screamed for me to stay still. The fear in their eyes was real, and it was enough to make my heart race. My mother's voice shook as she pointed towards the doorway. I froze, confused, unable to make sense of what they were seeing. They both swore they had seen something, a green, ghostly figure right in front of me, just as I was about to walk through the door. They said I was about to walk straight into it, that I hadn't noticed it. But I didn't see anything. There was nothing there, just the dim glow from the hallway light. They were shaking now, almost in a state of panic, but I saw no sign of whatever they were talking about. My sister, who normally didn't scare easily, was visibly upset. They both swore blind that it was real, that I had nearly walked into something terrible. I didn't know what to think. I couldn't see anything, but the look on their faces haunted me. It wasn't just fear, it was a raw kind of terror, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I wasn't sure what to do, so I just stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching them as they continued to point and shake their heads. It was only later, when I tried to forget the whole thing, that I realized how odd it had been. I never saw the green figure, but the fear in my mother's eyes stayed with me long after that night. As the years passed, the cottage seemed to grow quieter in some ways. The renovation was finished, and my family settled into a new routine, but something about the place still felt unsettled. I began to dismiss the strange noises, the footsteps, the feeling that something from the past was lingering. I convinced myself that it was just the house, just the sound of an old building settling. But no matter how many times I tried to convince myself, the memories of those nights stayed with me. It wasn't until years later that I had another experience that still feels too strange to ignore. My gran had died when I was a teenager. She was always such a big part of my life. She was the one who introduced me to music, especially the songs we used to listen to together. One of our favorites was The Girl from Ipanema by Astrud Gilberto. It was a song that always made us both smile. I remember her telling me that whenever she was having a tough day, that song would cheer her up, and we would listen to it over and over. After she passed, I thought about her often, but it wasn't until a couple of years later that I had an experience that still makes me feel a bit uneasy. I had gone to the bank to fill out some paperwork for an old account my gran had set up for me when I was little. It was a little strange to be handling the paperwork on my own, but I was trying to get everything sorted out. As I sat at the desk, filling out the forms, I noticed a busker outside playing his guitar. The melody of The Girl from Ipanema drifted through the window, faint at first, but gradually getting clearer. I froze. I couldn't help but think of my gran. The song was our song, the one we'd played together so many times. I looked out the window, and there he was, the busker, playing the familiar tune on his guitar. It was like the universe had decided to send me a little reminder of her. It was such a strange coincidence, and in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that my gran was somehow with me, in some way through the music. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, and I still don't, but that moment, with the busker playing our song right after I'd been dealing with my gran's account, was just too coincidental to ignore. It didn't feel like some supernatural message, it just felt like a sign, a reminder of someone I loved, someone I missed. Looking back, I realize how much that old house shaped me. It wasn't just the noises or the things we couldn't explain, it was the way it made me feel. The house had a history, a past, and it carried with it the weight of all the people who had lived there before us. Even after the renovation, even after we moved on, the memories of those old, creaky stairs, the footsteps, and the green figure still lingered in the back of my mind. The house had a way of making you feel like you weren't alone, even when you were. I never really figured out what was going on in that old cottage. Whether it was the house settling, a trick of the mind, or something else entirely. But I know one thing. It made me realize that sometimes, the things we can't explain are the things that stay with us the longest. My friend lived in a pretty rough neighborhood about 10 years ago. It wasn't the type of place you'd want to be out alone at night, but she didn't have much of a choice. She was young, just starting to figure out how to live on her own, and the apartment was cheap. She worked long hours, but she didn't mind. It was close enough to the city that she could still enjoy some freedom, but far enough that she could keep a bit of privacy. I think she liked the solitude more than she let on, even if it was in a neighborhood where you had to lock your doors twice at night. For the first few months, everything felt normal. She would come home after work, watch TV, and go to bed. But then, a strange thing started to happen. At first, it was subtle, just a feeling. She would walk into her apartment and instantly feel like something was off, like someone had been there when she wasn't home. She'd brush it off, telling herself she was just being paranoid. After all, she smoked a lot of weed back then, and anyone who knows that world will tell you it messes with your head. She'd laugh at herself, thinking maybe it was just the weed playing tricks. But then the little things started to change. She would come home, and the magnets on her fridge, those little goofy ones she had collected from local bars and restaurants, were out of place. At first, it didn't seem like much. Maybe she moved them without realizing it, right? People do that. But after a few weeks, she started to notice new magnets on the fridge, ones she had never seen before. They were from businesses that weren't even in her town. Some of them were from places in another state, ones she had never even visited. It was strange, but she told herself she was just being overly cautious. Things didn't stop there. She started finding cigarette butts in her ashtray, even though neither she nor any of her friends smoked that brand. They weren't fancy cigarettes either, just basic off-brand smokes, the kind you'd buy at a corner store when you didn't have much money. She'd never seen anyone else in her apartment, but there they were, these damn cigarette butts, piling up in her ashtray like someone had been sitting there smoking, just waiting for her to notice. That's when the panic set in. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things anymore. The things she had brushed off as paranoia were becoming too frequent, too specific to ignore. The worst part was that when she tried to talk to her friends about it, they just dismissed her concerns, saying it was probably just a side effect of smoking too much weed. Some even laughed at her, telling her she was probably just zoning out and moving the magnets herself. But she knew better. She knew something wasn't right. She tried to go to the police, but that didn't do much. They didn't take her seriously. The officer she spoke to barely even listened to her. He told her to lock her doors, keep her windows shut, and to stop worrying so much. "You're probably just paranoid, ma'am," he had said, brushing her off with a smirk. He made her feel like a fool for even asking for help. But she didn't feel like a fool. She felt trapped. The days started to blur together. She couldn't focus at work anymore because she was constantly looking over her shoulder. She would come home and check the locks on every door and window, but no matter what, she still felt like someone was watching her. One night, she was sitting in her apartment, lights off, trying to make it look like she wasn't home. She borrowed her boyfriend's car for the evening so she wouldn't be spotted. She wanted to just sit in the dark and listen, try to figure out what was going on, but mostly, she just wanted to be sure that no one was in there with her. She sat still for what felt like hours, listening to the creaks and groans of the building as it settled. She could hear the sounds of the city from outside, the traffic, people yelling, the distant hum of a siren, but inside her apartment, everything felt too quiet. Every little noise made her jump. Her heart started pounding harder with each passing second. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her just told her she needed to leave. It wasn't a thought, it was a gut feeling, primal, instinctual, and it didn't give her a choice. She grabbed her keys, rushed out of her apartment, and didn't look back until she was safely inside her boyfriend's car. When she finally looked back, standing there, hands shaking, she saw it. A massive silhouette, dark as night, climbing into her apartment through the balcony door. It wasn't a person she recognized, but the way it moved, the way it slipped into her apartment like it had done it 100 times before, was terrifying. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't staying there a minute longer. She moved out the next day, no hesitation. The apartment was packed up, the locks changed, and her things were gone by the end of the week. She never spoke to the landlord again, but he never called either. She moved into a new place, much safer, but the fear never fully left her. That feeling of being watched lingered for years. Not long after, I heard a similar story from my old manager. She had been having problems with her husband, a little spat over lost car keys. They were both too stubborn to admit who misplaced them, and it ended up being a huge hassle. They went to the dealership to get new keys made, waited around for days while the whole mess got sorted out. It was nothing unusual, except it didn't stop there. About 2 or 3 days after the key fiasco, my manager had to make an unscheduled stop at her house during the middle of the day. When she walked in, everything seemed off. The house was unnaturally quiet. No sign of her kids, which wasn't abnormal for a moment, but what she saw next sent chills down her spine. All of their electronics, their valuables, their jewelry, all of it was piled in the middle of the living room. It looked like someone had been collecting everything of value, just stacking it there. The TVs, the laptops, the jewelry boxes. Everything was in a neat little pile, like it had been waiting to be taken. She called the police right away, her heart racing. When they arrived and investigated, they found something that made the blood drain from her face. Someone had been living in their attic for nearly 2 months. The attic space was small, but there was enough room for a person to stay hidden, unnoticed. The police figured out that whoever it was had been sneaking in and out of the house while they were at work, using the attic as a base. The weird thing was, it wasn't just about the valuables. There were signs of food being eaten and a mattress that had been placed in the corner of the attic. Whoever had been there had made themselves comfortable. They moved out the next day, too. The whole family did. My manager and her husband didn't stay another night. Their 2 young daughters, still under 5, had been exposed to all that danger without even knowing it. The thought of someone hiding above them while they slept was enough to make anyone want to move far away. The police never found out who had been up there, but they had their suspicions. They were probably watching for weeks, biding their time. But whoever they were, they never came back. That was the last time I heard a story like that. But it stuck with me. Both of these stories, my friends and my managers, have haunted me. There's something about the idea of someone being in your space, living in your house, that just doesn't sit right. You think you're safe, but then you realize that safety is just an illusion. You could be in your own home, thinking everything is fine, and someone could be hiding in the walls, waiting. The scariest part? You might never even know it until it's too late. In the end, both my friend and my manager were lucky they listened to their instincts. They got out in time. And maybe, just maybe, that's all you can do, get out before it's too late. Trust your gut, because once they've got their claws in you, it's too late to fight back. You'll never truly feel safe again. It was a quiet night, one of those evenings when everything felt still and peaceful. I was 15, and my sister had asked me to babysit her kids, my niece and 2 nephews, while she and her husband went out for the evening. The kids were already in bed, and the house was silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I was sitting on the couch, my phone in hand, trying to kill time while keeping an eye on the kids through the baby monitor. My niece, Lily, was the only one still awake, lying in her bed, but with her eyes wide open. She had always been a bit of a night owl, and even though she was supposed to be sleeping, she was staring up at the ceiling, her small figure barely visible in the dim light. Everything seemed completely normal, except for one thing. Lily was staring into the dark corner of the room with this look on her face, like she was seeing something I couldn't. It was hard to explain, but there was something about the way she was acting that unsettled me. I didn't want to disturb her, so I just stayed quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, out of nowhere, she whispered, "That man keeps watching me." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. My first thought was that she had a bad dream or was imagining things. Kids that age sometimes have vivid imaginations, right? But something in the way she said it, the serious tone of her voice, made me feel uneasy. I glanced around the room quickly, thinking maybe she was pointing at something outside the window, or perhaps at one of the shadows cast by the streetlight. I saw nothing. There was no man standing in the corner, no silhouette in the window. I even checked the window blinds to make sure they were shut tight. Nothing out of the ordinary. "Lily," I said, trying to sound calm, "there's no one here. It's just your imagination." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she just continued to stare at the same spot. It was as if she hadn't even heard me. My stomach turned, and I felt a growing unease creeping up my spine, but I brushed it off as just one of those things. Kids had bad dreams. Maybe it was nothing. I tried to distract her, but I kept glancing around the room. Everything seemed fine, but then my phone buzzed. It was my dad, and the urgency in his voice was immediately apparent, even through the text message. "Are you okay? Please tell me you're okay." I frowned, wondering what could possibly be happening. It was just a normal night, wasn't it? "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, not understanding the sudden panic. "Why?" Then came the next message, which made my heart stop. "The neighbors just called the police. They said someone was looking in through your window. A man." I felt the blood drain from my face as my mind raced. Was it some prank? But then why would the neighbors call the police? I couldn't ignore it. I quickly grabbed the baby monitor and checked the kids again. They were all still in bed, thankfully. I went to the window and peeked through the blinds, scanning the front yard and the street outside. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the fear that something wasn't right. I had to find out what was going on, so I called my dad back. "Dad, I don't see anything," I said, trying to sound reassuring, but even to my own ears, I could hear the shakiness in my voice. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. The police are on their way." Just as I hung up the phone, there was a loud knock at the front door. I jumped, startled by how suddenly everything seemed to be happening. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved that the police were here or more scared because of the situation. My hands were trembling as I quickly made my way to the door, feeling like my heart was trying to pound its way out of my chest. I opened the door cautiously, and two uniformed police officers stepped inside. They didn't waste any time. One of them was tall and stocky, and the other was slimmer with a serious look on his face. Both looked like they had seen their fair share of troubling situations, but tonight was different. Tonight, they were all business. "Are you the babysitter?" the taller officer asked, his eyes scanning the inside of the house as though he was trying to spot anything out of place. I nodded. "Are the kids okay?" he continued. "They're fine. They're all in bed." I stepped back, allowing them to enter. The officer looked over at the stairs, his eyes narrow. "We need to make sure no one's inside. Stay with us." They moved through the house quickly, checking each room, sweeping the house for any signs of an intruder. They went upstairs to where the kids were, checking the windows and making sure everything was secure. My heart was still racing, and I had a constant feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. "We've got the guy," the officer said when they came back downstairs, sounding almost relieved. "He's in custody now." I was confused. "Wait, what? Who?" "The man the neighbors saw. He was drunk, and he was peeking through your window. We caught him outside. He had been following a woman from the bar down the road. He must have gotten confused when she ran into her house. He thought this house was hers." I felt a chill wash over me. A drunk man, stumbling around, unable to even tell which house was which? How could someone get so disoriented? It was beyond creepy. And to think that he had been watching me, watching my niece, the thought made me shudder. The officer continued. "The woman called the police when she saw him at your window, thinking he was trying to break in. She'd locked herself in her house when he tried to follow her inside, but he ended up over here." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This wasn't some harmless misunderstanding. This was someone who had been lurking around, drunk and confused, trying to break into my sister's house. He could have been at the door in seconds, and I would have never even known. The thought of it sent a wave of panic through me again. The officer spoke to me for a few more minutes, asking if I'd seen anything unusual, but I hadn't. They reassured me that I was safe now, that the man would be held in custody for the night. He would probably face charges for attempting to break in, public intoxication, and of course the peeping charges. But the entire situation felt surreal. I couldn't quite wrap my mind around it. Once the officers left, I locked the doors again, making sure every window was shut tight. The night felt suffocating now, the air thick with tension. I went upstairs and checked on the kids, who were all still fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the danger that had been lurking outside. I stayed up the rest of the night, just in case. I wasn't about to take any chances. I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had been to something terrible happening. If the police hadn't shown up when they did, or if the neighbors hadn't called them, who knows what would have happened. The next morning, my sister and her husband returned, and I told them what had happened. They were shocked and horrified, but they were also relieved that we were all safe. My sister gave me a big hug, thanking me for keeping her kids safe. I couldn't help but feel the weight of the night's events pressing on me as I explained everything to her. The police never caught the man's name, but they did say he was likely to spend the night in jail. He'd been drunk enough to forget which house he was supposed to be at, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about how dangerous the situation could have been. It was a close call, one I wouldn't forget anytime soon. The man was arrested for attempted forced entry, public intoxication, and peeping, but in the end, I was just grateful nothing happened to me or the kids. It was a long time before I felt truly comfortable babysitting again. Even after everything was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us, and that thought stuck with me for a long time. I had always heard of stories about strange things happening to people, but I never thought one of those stories would end up being about my close friend from university. This particular experience she had stuck with me, partly because it was so strange and horrifying, but also because I could never truly explain what happened that night. It all started during her placement year, when she was living in an old house with a couple of other girls and one guy. They were all working at the same company, and since they were new to the area, they decided to rent a house together. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Cheap rent, good company, and the chance to save some money before they all went their separate ways after the year. The house itself wasn't anything special. It was the kind of place you would expect to find in a small, quiet town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and sitting in the shadow of larger, more modern houses. But there was something about it that felt off, like it was one of those places that had seen too much and carried its history in the creaks of its floorboards and the cracks in its walls. My friend, let's call her Sarah, was living in the largest room upstairs with one of the other girls, Emily. The guy, Dan, lived in a room downstairs, while the third girl, Claire, took the smallest room upstairs. They all got along well enough, though Sarah and Emily were the closest of the group. It was a Friday night when the first thing happened. Sarah woke up suddenly, her heart pounding. It was around 2:30 a.m. She wasn't sure what had woken her, but it only took a moment for the sound to cut through the quiet, a loud bang on the front door. It was a deep, forceful thud that shook the house slightly. She froze, unsure if she had imagined it. The house was always creaky, but this was different. It was as if someone was actually trying to break down the door. She lay still for a few moments, straining to hear. There it was again, a loud bang, followed by another. It sounded like someone was hitting the door with something heavy. And then she heard it, a woman's voice, high-pitched, frantic, and scared. "Help! Please! Help me!" The sound sent a chill straight down her spine. Sarah didn't move at first. She just stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The door was right outside her bedroom, and the thought of someone standing there, banging and screaming in the middle of the night, made her stomach tighten with fear. She wasn't sure whether to go downstairs and check, or if she should call the police right away. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she glanced at the clock. It was just after 2:30 a.m. This didn't feel right. It didn't feel safe. After a moment, she picked up her phone and called Emily, who she knew would be awake too. The phone rang a few times, and then Emily answered, sounding equally rattled. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered urgently. There was a brief silence before Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. What the hell is going on? It's coming from the door, right?" Sarah nodded, though Emily couldn't see it. "I don't know what to do. We should wake Claire up then." But before Sarah could finish, the banging came again, even louder this time. It was as though whoever was out there was desperate to get in. The woman's scream cut through the night air again, louder this time, more insistent. It was terrifying. The urgency in the woman's voice sent a sick feeling to Sarah's stomach. "We need to stay quiet," Emily said. "Let's just stay in the room for now." The girls moved quietly in the dark, and they all gathered in the same room. The idea of being alone in their individual rooms seemed unbearable now. They huddled together, Sarah, Emily, and Claire, and waited. Every few minutes, the banging continued, followed by the woman's pleading screams. The more they listened, the more they realized the woman's screams weren't just for help. They sounded wrong. The desperation in her voice shifted into something else. As the minutes passed, the way she cried out seemed to twist and distort into something almost unrecognizable. It was like something or someone was trying to mimic a scream, but it didn't sound human anymore. "I don't know if I can do this," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't want to go down there. What if someone's waiting outside?" Sarah could feel her heart thudding painfully in her chest, but she couldn't let herself break down. "We have to be careful. If we open that door..." She trailed off, not sure what she was even suggesting. They were all terrified, but none of them had the courage to go down and check. The night dragged on like this for what felt like hours. The banging continued sporadically, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always persistent. The woman's voice continued to cry out for help in strange, distorted sounds, and every time the girls thought about doing something, anything, to help, fear stopped them. It was then that they decided to try calling Dan, who was downstairs. But when they dialed his number, there was no answer. They kept trying, their frustration mounting as the banging continued relentlessly. The only response they got was the buzzing sound of the phone ringing, unanswered. "Where is he?" Sarah whispered, her nerves fraying. "Why isn't he picking up?" But no answer came. By the time the banging finally stopped, it was nearly 4 a.m. The house felt eerily quiet again, but none of the girls had the courage to sleep alone. They all huddled together in Sarah's room, too afraid to even close their eyes. Their minds raced with all kinds of terrifying possibilities. The morning finally came, but the unease from the night before still hung in the air. As the sun filtered through the windows, the girls slowly began to emerge from the room. They were exhausted, their eyes wide from lack of sleep, but they had one question that had to be answered. They approached Dan's room cautiously, knocking lightly. When he opened the door, they all stared at him, hoping to hear some kind of explanation. "Did you hear anything last night?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dan blinked, looking groggy and confused. "No, I slept through the whole night." "Why? What happened?" The girls exchanged uneasy glances, and Sarah felt a rising sense of suspicion. He had to have heard something. How could he have slept through that? "Seriously?" Emily asked, her voice rising. "You didn't hear the banging? The screaming?" Dan seemed genuinely puzzled. "No, I didn't hear anything. You guys were just freaked out. Maybe you imagined it." Sarah wasn't convinced. She had no idea what to think anymore. Dan wasn't acting like someone who had been as terrified as the rest of them. His calm demeanor didn't match the chaos they had experienced. Later that day, Sarah picked up the local paper to catch up on the news. When she turned to the crime section, her blood ran cold. There, in bold letters, was an article about a string of robberies happening in the area. The article explained how groups of men had been using a distressed woman to lure unsuspecting people into opening their doors. The woman would knock on doors, screaming for help, and when someone opened up to let her in, the group of men would rush in and rob them. It sent chills down Sarah's spine when she read that. It all made sense now. The woman's voice wasn't genuine, it was a ruse, a trap. The banging on the door, the screams for help, it was all part of the plan. The group of men outside had likely been waiting for someone to fall for the trap. Sarah felt a wave of relief mixed with disgust. They had narrowly escaped whatever dangerous plan had been set into motion. But the thought of Dan's indifference, his complete denial, still gnawed at her. She wasn't sure whether he was genuinely unaware or whether he had been too scared to leave his room, not wanting to face whatever was going on outside. The girls continued to live in the house for a while longer, but the atmosphere had changed. Every night, they would lock all the doors, double-check the windows, and make sure they were as safe as they could be. They would never be able to shake the fear of what had happened that night. As for Dan, the questions surrounding his behavior lingered. Sarah wasn't sure if she could ever fully trust him again, not after what happened. But the worst part was knowing how close they had come to being part of something much worse. After all, when it comes to trusting strangers, sometimes it's not just the ones who knock that you need to worry about. It's the ones who pretend not to hear the knock at all. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. I had just turned 16, still at that age where I was still holding on to little quirks from my childhood, sleeping with my covers pulled up over my head, just a small hole to breathe out of. I don't really know why I did it, but somehow the covers made me feel safe, like they were a barrier between me and whatever was lurking outside my little bubble of warmth. Maybe it was because when I was younger, I had an irrational fear of my room. It was my own private world during the day, but at night, it felt different, colder, almost like it wasn't entirely mine. I had grown used to my dad getting up in the middle of the night. He'd always get up at around the same time, somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., to go to the bathroom and get a drink of water. It was a routine I had grown familiar with, so much so that I didn't think much of it. If I heard footsteps down the hallway, I'd just roll over and wait for the sound of him going into the bathroom, maybe the creak of the floorboards near the kitchen as he grabbed his glass, and then everything would go quiet again. That night, though, was different. I woke up suddenly. It wasn't the sound of my dad getting up. It was something wrong. The footsteps were slower, deliberate. I felt the tension in the air, the way it seemed to hang just a bit heavier than usual. My heart started to race. I had no real reason to be scared, but something felt off, like there was a change in the atmosphere, a disturbance I couldn't quite explain. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps continued, and they stopped at my bedroom door. This wasn't normal. My dad always just walked past my room, straight to the bathroom. The fact that the footsteps stopped right outside my door felt strange. I kept my eyes closed, hoping that maybe I had imagined it. But no, the footsteps remained silent. The kind of silence that felt thicker than air. My mind raced as I wondered if maybe my dad had just decided to stand there for some reason. Maybe he was tired, maybe he was lost in thought, I didn't know. I pulled the covers down just enough to poke my head out, trying to catch a glimpse of him. "Dad," I whispered into the dark, my voice shaking just slightly. I waited for a response, something, anything. But what I heard wasn't my dad's familiar voice. It wasn't even a grunt of acknowledgement. It was a breath, a long, slow exhale, soft, almost wind-like in its quality. H. I froze. That wasn't right. My dad didn't breathe like that. And certainly not in the doorway of my room, in the middle of the night. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't him. I pulled the covers back over my head, so fast it felt like I might have pulled every muscle in my body. My heart was hammering in my chest, so loud I could barely hear anything else. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, paralyzed by whatever was standing at my door. That breath, the sound of it lingering in the air, like it was drawing something from me, something dark and chilling. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just my dad, and I had misunderstood. But deep down I knew something was wrong. I lay there, with my head buried in the covers, too scared to even peek out. Time felt like it had stretched, the minutes crawling by at a snail's pace. My mind raced through every possible explanation, trying to justify what had happened. Maybe it was just a bad dream, but everything felt too real, too sharp for it to be a dream. Maybe I was just paranoid, but what if it wasn't? I waited, and waited. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it might smother me. I could still hear my heart, thumping against my ribcage, still feeling that cold, creeping anxiety crawling up my spine. I stayed frozen, still, until I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly peeled the covers off my face, only enough to stick my head out again. The hallway was still dark, but I could see the vague outline of my bedroom door. The figure stood there. It wasn't my dad. I couldn't see any details, no face, no features. It was just a shape, tall, standing still in the doorway, almost glowing in the dark. A pale, white figure. At first, I thought it might just be my eyes playing tricks on me, but the longer I stared at it, the more real it seemed, the more solid. I couldn't make out anything else. No eyes, no expression. Just this blank, featureless silhouette, standing completely still. The way it loomed in the doorway made my stomach churn, my breath catch in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there. I don't know how long I stared at it. Minutes, hours. Time felt irrelevant at that point. Every second dragged on. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but I couldn't. I felt too small, too helpless, as if my voice would be swallowed up by the air in the room. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to look again. I had to know if it was still there. Slowly, I peered out from under the covers once more. The figure was gone. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. The doorway was empty. My breath caught in my throat, relief washing over me. It was over. But then again, was it? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there wide-eyed, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. The night stretched on like it had no end. And then, as dawn began to break, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and dread. I had to know what happened. I had to ask. The next morning, I hesitated before asking my parents. I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. But when I asked them if they'd been at my door during the night, both of them looked at me, puzzled. No, they said, we both slept through the night. I couldn't believe it. My dad, who always woke up to go to the bathroom, had been asleep the whole time. My mom hadn't heard anything either. So who had been at my door? It's been years since that night. I've never had anything like it happen again, and maybe I never will. But I've always wondered what it was. The white figure, the breath, the way it stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting. I never told anyone about it, not until now. And even now, I can't really explain it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something more. But either way, I'll never forget the feeling of someone, standing at my door in the dead of night, breathing softly, waiting for me to look. It was one of those evenings when the air feels thick with something unspoken, a hint of tension woven into the silence of a small village in Assam. I had come to visit my cousin, who had recently moved to a bungalow near the river, and I was looking forward to a few days of quiet and simplicity away from the noise of the city. The bungalow was modest, with wooden walls that creaked in the wind and a porch that overlooked the river, which shimmered under the fading light of the day. The surrounding village was peaceful, tucked away from the bustling streets of urban India, and it felt like stepping back in time. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sky still tinged with the orange of sunset. There was a palpable sense of calm in the air. The village was small, with no more than a few dozen houses scattered across the land. The people were kind, offering shy smiles as they went about their business, and the only sound most of the time was the gentle rustling of the trees and the occasional call of a bird. I immediately felt at ease. That evening, we decided to stay indoors, as the wind had picked up, making the outside air cold and biting. My cousin and his friends, a small group of easygoing guys, were all about having a good time. We gathered around the fireplace inside the bungalow, the crackling of the fire adding warmth to the room. Soon enough, it turned into a barbecue of sorts, with skewers of meat sizzling over the flames. The scent of grilled food filled the room, and the laughter of my cousin and his friends echoed in the air. I indulged in the food more than I probably should have. It tasted amazing, and I couldn't resist going back for more. But as the night wore on, I began to feel a little off. My stomach churned with the heaviness of the meal, and a vague sense of queasiness settled in. I couldn't shake it. After a while, I excused myself from the group and stepped outside, hoping that some fresh air would settle my stomach. The wind had picked up even more, whipping around the trees and causing the leaves to rustle. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The air was cold and crisp, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the bungalow. I walked for some time, not sure where I was going, but simply needing to get away from the noise inside. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth beneath me, and the sound of the river, which I could hear in the distance, was oddly calming. After a while, I found myself at the boundary embankment of a nearby tea plantation. The place seemed almost deserted, the rows of tea bushes stretching out in front of me, their dark silhouettes barely visible under the dim light of the moon. There were no lights anywhere in sight, except for the faint reflection of the moon on the river. It was so quiet, so still, that I couldn't help but feel like I had stepped into another world, one where the usual sounds of life were muted, replaced by the heavy weight of solitude. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or something I had imagined. But as I took a few more steps forward, I could clearly make it out, a large, irregular cluster of something along the riverbank. It glowed faintly like jelly, luminescent and slick in the dim light. It was odd, and my curiosity piqued despite the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. The cluster was much bigger than I had expected, a large mass that seemed to pulse softly, as if it were alive, and embedded within it were strange objects. What appeared to be metal shards, jagged and sharp, scattered throughout the substance like forgotten relics. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but the sight sent a cold shiver down my spine. I had heard stories of odd things in the countryside, strange phenomena that didn't quite make sense, but I had never thought much of them. Now, standing there in the dark, staring at this mysterious, glowing mass, my mind raced. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Part of me wanted to get closer, to touch it and figure out what it was, but another part of me screamed to stay away. I had no idea what this thing was, but something about it felt off. Too off. I felt like I was trespassing in some place I wasn't meant to be. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, too terrified to move closer, but also unable to turn away. The night was heavy with tension, the wind howling through the trees around me, and I felt as though the whole world was holding its breath. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I turned and hurried back to the bungalow. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my stomach, which had initially been unsettled from the food, now churned in a completely different way. Back inside, the others were still enjoying the barbecue, oblivious to my discovery. I couldn't bring myself to tell them. I was too shaken, too unsure of what I had just witnessed. I wanted to believe that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew I hadn't. I had seen something strange and unexplainable. The next morning, I mentioned what I had found, hoping to laugh it off as a weird experience, but the others only laughed at me. They were too stuffed from the food and too drunk to take me seriously. I didn't blame them. If I were in their shoes, I probably wouldn't believe me either. But the memory of that glowing, jelly-like substance was still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole day passed without incident, and by the time evening rolled around, We all agreed to go back to the riverbank to see if anything was left of what I had found. My heart raced as we walked toward the spot. It felt like the entire landscape had changed overnight. The air was thick with uncertainty, and I couldn't help but feel like we were heading into unknown territory. When we reached the riverbank, the first thing I noticed was that there was no sign of the cluster I had seen the night before. No glowing mass, no metal shards, no trace of anything. It was as if it had never been there at all. The ground, which had been soft and clayey, was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints, no evidence that anyone or anything had been there recently. Nothing. It was as if the earth itself had erased the memory of what I had witnessed. I stood there, feeling a wave of confusion wash over me. I wasn't sure whether to be relieved or more frightened. The fact that there was no trace of the cluster, no sign of it at all, made it all the more unsettling. It felt wrong, like the whole situation had been wiped clean, as though it had never happened. The others didn't understand. They still thought I was just being paranoid, and I couldn't convince them otherwise. I tried to explain again, pointing to the spot where I had seen the strange substance, but they only shrugged it off. I knew they wouldn't believe me. They were too busy making fun of my wild imagination to take it seriously. But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't unsee it, no matter how much they joked about it. The memory of that glowing, jelly-like substance, of the metal shards embedded in it, stayed with me. And the fact that it had disappeared without a trace, without any explanation, only deepened the mystery. To this day, I'm not sure what I encountered that night. Maybe it was some kind of natural phenomenon, something that couldn't be explained. Maybe it was some strange chemical reaction in the environment. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something beyond my understanding. But whatever it was, it left an impression on me that I can't shake. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but most of the time, they laugh it off. They don't believe me, and I get it. It sounds unreal, like something out of a movie, but I know what I saw, and I can't forget it. Every time I think back to that night, to the moonlit riverbank and the strange glowing mass, a chill runs down my spine. Some things don't need to be understood to be real. They just exist, in the shadows, waiting for someone to notice. And maybe, just maybe, it's better not to know what that thing really was. I had just turned 18, working my first real job at a retail store that felt like a dead end, but somehow exciting because it was a step towards independence. It was summer, so the heat was suffocating, but I was making enough money to feel a little freer. One afternoon, my older brother came by to visit me during my lunch break. He was always the kind of person to show up when I least expected it, always full of energy, and never shy to drag me into some spontaneous plan. He asked me to join him for lunch at the taco cabana down the street. I looked at the clock, 30 minutes until my break was over. I figured I could walk there. It wasn't far, and I could use a smoke anyway. We didn't have much planned for the day, and just hanging out with him sounded like a good distraction from the mundane routine of retail life. So we walked out of the store, heading down the alley that ran behind a strip of stores. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to hang out in, dim, narrow, and lined with the back doors of businesses. It wasn't even a proper alley, really, just a gap between two rows of buildings. But it was a shortcut, and when you're young, you don't think much about the risks. It's just a path to get from point A to point B. We didn't care about the heat, the dust, or the strange air around us. I remember the walk being quiet, aside from the occasional chatter between us. We didn't see anyone else back there, no one walking, no cars parked, no one milling about. It felt like a ghost town, which should have been a red flag but wasn't. We could still see the cars on the street in the distance, the occasional honk from a passing driver, but we were tucked away behind these buildings, out of sight. That's when I noticed the truck. It was a dark-colored, older model, rusting in places with a dented rear bumper. The truck was parked in the middle of the alley, blocking any real path ahead of us. The driver's side window was rolled down just enough to let the smoke from a cigarette curl out. The man sitting in the driver's seat was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap that shaded his eyes. He stared at us as we walked past, and I could feel his gaze even before I looked over. It was the kind of look that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I could feel my brother stiffen beside me. We weren't doing anything wrong, just walking to lunch, but there was something about the way he watched us that made me uneasy. Being teenagers, we did what most teenagers do when they're bored and feeling reckless. We started messing around. My brother grabbed an empty beer bottle from the ground and threw it at the pavement. It shattered with a satisfying pop, the glass scattering across the alley. I followed suit, tossing a bottle myself. We were just being jerks, nothing more, but looking back, I wish we had just kept walking. We didn't need to provoke anything. As we neared the end of the alley, where it opened up to the street, I heard a roar of an engine. The truck that had been sitting still behind us suddenly came to life, revving as it shot forward with an alarming speed. My brother was just a step ahead of me, and I saw his eyes widen as the truck barreled toward us. It was too fast, too close, and before I could process what was happening, the truck swerved right in front of us, blocking the path. The man from the truck was out of the vehicle in an instant. His movement was fast, too fast for someone his age, and the way he moved didn't feel right. His eyes were wide, frantic, as he yanked open the door and came around the front of the truck. In his hand was a gun, pointed straight at us. My heart stopped. My brother's face went pale, and I could see him freeze in place, his body rigid. The man was shouting at us, his words jumbling together in a harsh, screeching voice. "I finally caught you, ****ing with this place," he yelled, the gun still in his hand. I could see the rage in his eyes, the way his hands shook as he gripped the gun. We stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. The air around us felt thick, like it was closing in. I could hear my brother's breath quickening as the man ranted, his words barely making sense. He kept repeating, "I finally got you, and you won't get away this time." For a split second, I thought we were going to die. There was no doubt in my mind. I thought the gun would go off, and we'd be left there in the alley. I tried to keep my composure, tried to force myself to think clearly, but nothing made sense. We had never done anything wrong, never messed with this place, as the guy claimed, but the man's anger felt like it could boil over at any moment. My brother, still in a daze, tried to back up, but the man blocked our way. He was yelling into his phone now, his voice frantic as he kept shouting at someone on the other end of the line. "I got them," he screamed. "I found them. We're going to the police station." At this point, I realized something. This wasn't right. None of it was. I could hear his words, but something in my gut told me he wasn't talking to anyone. There was no dispatcher on the other end of that phone call. He was lying. His whole demeanor felt like a man who had snapped, who was looking for an excuse to take control of a situation that wasn't real. My brother, sensing the same thing, spoke up. "We'll wait for the cops," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We're not getting in that truck with you." The man didn't seem to hear him. He came forward, grabbing my brother by the arm, trying to drag him toward the truck. My brother yanked his arm away, stepping back, his face flushed with fear but also defiance. "We're not going with you," he said, louder this time. "You can either wait for the cops, or you can use that gun, but we're not getting in your truck." The man stopped for a moment, staring at my brother. His face twisted in frustration, like he was processing what had just been said, trying to decide if he could force us to do what he wanted. For a brief moment, I thought he might pull the trigger, but then, just as suddenly as it had all started, he cursed under his breath. "Fuck this," he muttered, his voice low and dripping with rage. He turned back to his truck, the gun still in his hand, and got in without another word. He slammed the door shut, revved the engine one more time, and peeled out of the alley, disappearing in a cloud of dust. We stood there, in complete silence, for what felt like forever. My brother and I didn't speak. We didn't even look at each other. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my body frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. We just stood there. I kept expecting him to come back. I kept expecting the truck to reappear, but it didn't. Eventually, after what felt like 10 minutes of disbelief, we walked the rest of the way to Taco Cabana. It was quiet between us the whole way. Neither of us spoke. We didn't joke around, didn't say anything. We just walked in silence, a silence that felt heavier with every step. When we finally got to Taco Cabana, we ordered our food without saying a word. We sat down and ate, but the whole time, there was this feeling inside me that wouldn't go away. The fear, the uncertainty, the shock. We didn't talk about it. Not then, not later. It was just too much. Even when we got home, we never told our parents. It felt like a dream, like it wasn't real, but the fear still lingered, gnawing at me, reminding me of that moment when I thought we might not make it out of that alley. It wasn't until years later, after I moved out and started reflecting on everything, that I realized how lucky we were. That man could have done anything. We were completely at his mercy, and somehow we made it out. I still don't know why he was there, or what he really wanted. I don't know if he was some kind of vigilante, or just a man who had lost control. But what I do know is that every time I walk down an alley now, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. That same feeling of unease that gripped me back, then comes rushing back. I wish I had done something differently, but I didn't. We didn't. We survived. That's all that matters now. I used to live in England, a small town tucked away in the countryside. The kind of place where you barely saw another soul on the streets, and the roads seemed to stretch on forever, lined by fields that went on until they were swallowed up by the distance. I was 11 years old at the time, living a life that felt small and quiet, but safe. At least, that's what I thought until one afternoon when everything changed. It was a late summer day, one of those days where the sun hangs lazily in the sky, and the air smells of fresh cut grass and warm earth. My friend, who lived on a farm just outside of town, and I had decided to take a walk down one of those long, empty country roads. We didn't have much else to do. The towns around us were small, each with only a handful of houses, and there was no one else to hang out with. So we walked, talking about nothing in particular, just passing time. It was a familiar walk. We had done it countless times before. The kind of walk where you could hear your footsteps echoing against the stillness of the fields. The road we were on was one of those that stretched for miles without a single building in sight. It was the sort of place where, if you stood still long enough, the silence would press in on you like a heavy weight. No one ever came by on these roads. Cars were few and far between, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind or the distant calls of birds. It was the kind of place where you'd expect to walk all day without seeing another person. But on this particular day, things changed. Out of nowhere, a white car appeared, pulling up slowly alongside us. It didn't honk, didn't speed by. It just slowed down and stopped next to us. The engine hummed softly as the car sat there, idling in the middle of nowhere. My friend and I stopped walking, glancing at the car with the kind of curious, cautious look that children often give things they don't understand. I remember the woman in the back seat. Her face was blank, emotionless. She was staring straight ahead, not looking at us, not looking anywhere. Her eyes were wide open, but they didn't seem to see anything. It was the kind of stare that made your skin crawl, even though she wasn't doing anything. The silence between us and her was thick, like something was wrong, but neither of us knew what. Then the door opened. A large man, built like a wall of muscle, stepped out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a dark jacket, and his face was unreadable, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved. His presence alone made me feel uneasy. He was tall, towering really, and his dark eyes scanned us quickly, as if evaluating whether we were worth his time. There was something about the way he looked at us that made me feel like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator. Then, in a thick accent, he shouted at us, "Get in the fucking car." The words hit us like a slap in the face. My heart pounded, and my breath caught in my chest. We didn't move. We didn't know what to do. I looked at my friend, and I could see the same fear in her eyes, the same disbelief. It didn't make sense. Why would a stranger tell us to get into his car? Why did he sound so angry? Before we could react, the man moved quickly, too quickly. He reached us in a matter of seconds, grabbing both of us by the necks. His grip was iron-tight, unyielding. I remember the sheer force of it. It was as if he was trying to crush us with his hands. My friend and I both tried to pull away, but his hands were like vices. I could feel the strength in his fingers digging into my skin, his thumbs pressing against my throat. We both struggled, fighting for air, but it felt hopeless. "Get in the fucking car," he shouted again, his voice rising in anger. I don't know how, but we both managed to yell, to scream as loud as we could. We shouted for help, but no one was around. The road was still empty, the only sound our panicked breaths and the beating of our hearts in our chests. I remember how the air seemed to close in around us, how it felt like time was moving in slow motion. The car, the man, everything was closing in, and I couldn't think clearly. Then, he punched me in the stomach. The force of it knocked the wind out of me, and I gasped for breath, doubling over in pain. My friend screamed as he kicked her in the ribs, and I heard her crying out, struggling to break free. The man wasn't holding back. It was like he didn't see us as children at all. We were just obstacles to him, something to be moved out of the way. His punches were savage, brutal, and I could feel each one like a strike to my soul. It was the kind of pain that goes beyond physical. It's the kind that tells you deep down that things are wrong in a way that no one should ever experience. I thought in that moment that this was it. We were going to die here, alone on this empty road, at the hands of a man who had no reason to care about us. The thought of never seeing my family again, never getting to go home, made my stomach twist in fear. But as the man raised his hand to hit me again, something happened. A work van, came down the road. It wasn't fast, but it was enough. The sound of the engine broke through the quiet, and for just a split second, the man's attention wavered. It was enough. He let go of us, almost like he was startled, confused by the interruption. Without a word, he turned and ran back to his car, slamming the door behind him. The car peeled away, tires screeching as it disappeared down the road. I don't know why he let us go. Maybe he thought we'd scream and attract attention. Maybe the van scared him off. I don't know. All I know is that, in that moment, we were lucky. We didn't move for a few minutes. We were both too shaken, too terrified to speak. My friend was crying, and I was just staring at the ground, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When I finally found my voice, I grabbed her hand, and together, we ran back the way we came. We didn't care about anything else. We just needed to get home, to feel safe again. The whole walk back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that white car following us, its headlights gleaming in the dark. But there was nothing, just the quiet road and the weight of what had just happened hanging over us. When we finally got back to my friend's house, we didn't tell anyone. I don't know why we didn't. Maybe we didn't want to believe it had happened. Maybe we were too scared to put it into words. But we both knew. We both felt the weight of it, the terror, the rawness of what could have been. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every car passing by outside, sent a jolt of fear through me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart still racing. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, the way he looked at us like we were nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling of his hands around my neck. To this day, I still find it hard to walk alone, even in broad daylight. I don't know what would have happened if that van hadn't driven by. Maybe we'd still be here, telling the story. Or maybe we wouldn't. I don't know. All I do know is that some things change you. You can never fully forget the feeling of being so helpless, of being so close to losing everything. And that feeling stays with you, no matter how much time passes. That night taught me something I never wanted to know. How quickly everything can change, and how easy it is for danger to find you when you least expect it. I don't walk on those quiet roads anymore, and I don't look at white cars the same way. Some parts of my childhood are gone, replaced by the harsh reality of what the world can be. But I'm here. We're here. And for that, I'm grateful. I wasn't sure why I was staring out the window that night. It was one of those evenings when everything feels a bit too quiet, like the world is holding its breath. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, and the dim glow of twilight still clung to the edges of the sky. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the shadows had begun creeping across the yard, stretching over the small hill that led down into the other houses at the bottom of the hill. I was at my aunt's house, sitting on the old worn-out couch, trying to ignore the hum of the TV that had been running in the background for hours. The sound of it was distant, almost like a buzzing in my ears. My aunt, as always, had the house filled with clutter, old religious books, candles, and the smell of something burning. Incense or oils. I couldn't tell. I don't know what made me walk over to the back window, but I did. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe I was just bored, waiting for time to pass before I could leave. Either way, I ended up standing there, looking out over her backyard. Her backyard wasn't large. It was mostly just a small, steep hill with a little plateau at the bottom where it leveled out. Beyond that, you could see a few other small houses. There was no real privacy. Everything felt open, exposed. The lights from the neighboring houses flickered in the distance, like stars caught in the throes of a dim evening. At first, I just watched the hill. It was nothing special, just the fading light of evening slowly enveloping everything. But as I stared, something caught my eye. It was a little below where the trees started at the base of the hill, closer to the bottom, where the backyard turned into the plateau. At first, I thought it was just some kind of trick of the light, maybe the way the branches of the trees swayed in the wind or a bug flying by. But then I realized that it wasn't either of those things. It wasn't something natural. There were lights. Not bright, blinding lights, but enough to stand out against the dimming backdrop of the evening. I thought it was just a reflection at first. Maybe a car passing by, maybe even some strange reflection from inside the house. But when I focused, I could tell it wasn't any of those things. I saw several small, bright orbs floating just above the ground. They were moving in small, tight circles, almost like atoms in an animation. Those cartoon versions you see in science videos, with colorful lines spinning around each other. They weren't stationary either. They were moving. They were spinning and weaving in the air like some kind of strange dance, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make any sense to me. There was no way a bug or some car headlights, or even a firefly could do what I was seeing. It was like these orbs were alive, and they were moving with purpose. I felt a chill run through me, then another, and then another. Each one made me tense up, my body freezing like I was somehow connected to what I was seeing. I wasn't sure why I was so scared. It didn't feel natural, though. It didn't feel normal. There was something so wrong about it. I tried to pull my gaze away, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop watching. I couldn't make sense of it. The orbs were still spinning and weaving, so bright and colorful, like little stars. Only they weren't stars. They were something else, something I couldn't identify. The longer I looked, the more I felt like I was seeing something I wasn't meant to see. My heart started pounding in my chest, my body growing colder. I wanted to scream or shout for someone, but I didn't. I felt paralyzed, like if I moved, I would lose the connection to whatever was happening, whatever was out there. The orbs shifted, their movements becoming faster, more erratic. I could feel my breathing growing shallow, every inch of me on edge. It was as if something was pulling at me, drawing me in. I wanted to look away. I wanted to pull myself back from the window and forget I had ever seen anything, but I couldn't. I was trapped in that moment, watching the lights move around each other, faster now, spinning so quickly that I could barely make them out. Then suddenly the orbs stopped. It wasn't gradual. One moment, they were spinning like crazy, and the next they just froze. Everything went silent. It was as if the world around me had paused, holding its breath with me. I felt my heart racing in my chest, and my skin was crawling. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, the orbs vanished. I didn't see them fade away. They didn't just slowly disappear into the darkness. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, like they had never been there at all. For a long time, I just stood there at the window, my hands resting against the cool glass, my mind racing. I didn't know what I had seen. I didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before. After a long while, I finally pulled myself away from the window, my legs stiff and shaky. My whole body felt wrong, like I had been caught in something I couldn't understand. I walked back into the living room, where my aunt was sitting, reading one of her books, and I told her what I'd seen. I wasn't sure what I was expecting her to say. Maybe something comforting, something that would make sense of it all. But instead, she just nodded and didn't say much. My mom was there too, sitting on the couch, but she didn't look up. She just kept watching TV, as if the whole thing was just another thing for her to ignore. They didn't question me, though. They didn't laugh or tell me I was imagining things. They didn't try to brush it off. They just acted like they believed me. And that scared me even more. I don't know what I saw that night, but I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't something I was meant to see. I never went back to my aunt's house after that. The memories of those lights, those spinning orbs, still haunt me sometimes. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still feel that cold shiver that ran through me that night. I can still see the way the orbs moved, the way they defied everything I knew about the world. What was it? I don't know, but I don't think I'll ever forget it. I was about 14 years old at the time. It was a quiet, normal afternoon, and I was sitting at my computer in the room I spent most of my time in. My desk was positioned in front of the window that faced our front yard, and directly behind me, the glass front door loomed, giving me a perfect view of the street and the few houses across from us. It was a pretty chill setup for playing video games, and I spent hours like that, mostly immersed in my games. On that particular day, I was playing Command and Conquer, Tiberian Sun, fully invested in the strategy and the missions when something strange happened. Up until that point, the day had been as usual as it gets. I'd just finished lunch and was feeling pretty good about my progress in the game. The sun was shining through the windows, and the house was quiet, No one was home except for me. That in itself wasn't too unusual, but it felt a bit too quiet, if that makes sense. I remember this uneasy shift in the air, like the energy around me had changed. It was subtle at first, but something in my gut told me that something wasn't right. It was one of those gut feelings that you can't explain, but you know it's there. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a feeling like someone was watching me. It wasn't a creepy thought at first, just the kind of thing you shrug off and keep going, but it stuck with me. For some reason, my instincts kicked in, and without really thinking about it, I slowly turned my head toward the front door. What I saw froze me in place. There was a figure standing just beside the door, so close I could make out its outline even from where I sat. The figure was tall, way taller than the door itself. In fact, it had to be bending sideways just to peek through the glass, as if it were trying to get a better look at something inside. The shape was almost solid, but there was something unsettling about it. It was pitch black, like no details, no color at all, just dark, like it was absorbing light instead of reflecting it. It was wearing something that almost looked like a coat, or maybe a jacket of some kind. I couldn't really tell because the figure was too tall, and its body was distorted in such a way that I couldn't make out many details. But the thing that really stuck with me was its hat. It had a wide-brimmed, old-timey hat, something you might picture a farmer or someone from an old Western film wearing. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see in an old black-and-white photo, but here it was, standing in my front yard in broad daylight. There was no mistaking it, though. I knew it was looking at me. Even though I couldn't see its face, there was this overwhelming sense that its attention was fully on me. The figure didn't move much, just stood there, almost still, just peering in through the glass like it was waiting for something. I couldn't breathe. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the figure, but it felt like forever. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of anything. I tried to convince myself that it was just some odd person walking by, maybe someone doing a yard check or something, but no, this wasn't that. The figure wasn't behaving like anyone I'd ever seen before. It was too tall, too unnatural, and the way it stood there, like it was almost trying to blend into the glass, felt wrong. Finally, I managed to pull myself together enough to look away. I turned back to my computer screen, trying to refocus on the game, but the image of that figure was burned into my mind. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, maybe a figment of my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, I gathered the courage to look back at the door. I turned around slowly, bracing myself for whatever I was about to see. The figure was gone, just like that. It had vanished without a trace. No sound of footsteps, no sign that it had even been there. The glass door was empty, nothing but the reflection of my room staring back at me. I don't think I'll ever forget how quiet it was in that moment. There was no breeze, no movement at all, just stillness. I sat there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to run and tell someone, but another part of me didn't want to sound crazy. After all, what could I possibly say? That I saw some tall figure with a dark coat and a hat peering through my front door? It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. That thing wasn't just some trick of the light or a weird shadow. It was tangible, solid in a way that made everything else feel insignificant. I tried to go about my day like nothing had happened, but it was impossible. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I glanced at the front door, I expected to see it standing there again, watching me. But it never returned. The hours passed, and the house remained quiet. By the time evening came, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just tired or had been caught up in the game for too long. That night, I stayed up late, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. It wasn't until later that I started wondering why it had been there in the first place. Why would someone, if that's what it was, stand there and just watch me without doing anything? Was it some kind of intruder? Or maybe someone who just wanted to mess with me? The thought kept me awake for hours, and I found myself glancing at the front door every now and then, waiting for any sign of movement, even though I knew deep down that it wouldn't be there again. The next morning, I told my parents about what I saw. They didn't dismiss it outright, but they didn't seem to take it seriously either. They suggested it could have been a person from the neighborhood or a delivery driver I didn't recognize. But none of that made sense. Whoever, or whatever, it didn't act like anyone I knew. It was something else entirely. I never saw that figure again. Life went on, And over time, I started to forget about it, as strange as that sounds. I had other things to think about, and the memory of it slowly faded into the background. But there was one thing that I could never shake, the feeling that it wasn't just a random occurrence. That figure had been looking at me for a reason. Maybe it had been just watching, or maybe it was waiting for something, but I'll never know for sure. Even now, when I pass by a house with a front door made of glass, I can't help but glance inside, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure standing there, watching me again. It's one of those things that stays with you, a moment in time that you can't forget, no matter how hard you try. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I still feel that same strange unease, the feeling that someone is watching me from just outside the door waiting. I was 8 years old, lying in bed in the dark. It was one of those nights where the room felt colder than usual, and the darkness seemed a little too thick, like it was pressing in on me. I was trying to fall asleep, my eyes half closed, my blanket pulled up to my chin. The only sound was the quiet hum of the house, like it was breathing with me. But even though I couldn't see much in the dark, I knew something wasn't right. I don't know what made me feel that way, but I knew. I could feel eyes on me. At first, I thought maybe it was my imagination, or maybe I had just woken up from a bad dream. But then I saw them. They were faces all around me. Not just one or two, but a whole bunch. They were floating, like they were just there. I couldn't make out every detail, but I could see their eyes, wide and staring, unmoving. It was like they were looking right through me, not at me, but still, I could feel the weight of their gaze. I remember one of them the most clearly, though. He had motorcycle glasses on, the kind my dad used to wear when he was riding his bike. I don't know why, but that stuck with me. Maybe it was because my dad was always around when I was little, and seeing someone who looked like him, but not really, made it feel more real, like it was someone I should know, but didn't. My heart started pounding, thudding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink without feeling like they'd notice. I just lay there, staring at the dark figures, frozen in place. I knew I had to pretend to be asleep. If I didn't move, maybe they wouldn't notice that I was awake. Maybe if I stayed perfectly still, they wouldn't do anything. I didn't know if they would hurt me or just leave me alone, but the idea of them doing anything at all made me want to scream. I kept my breathing shallow, pretending to sleep, hoping that if I didn't give them any reason to act, they wouldn't. The silence stretched on. The faces didn't move. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath too. Then, through the silence, I heard something faint. It was like music, soft and distant, coming from the living room. It was hard to tell what it was exactly, but it was there. Faint, but definitely there. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was just the radio. Maybe my mom was playing something while she did housework. But the music didn't make sense. It felt off, like it was too quiet for a radio, too distant for someone else to be up this late. The minutes passed, or maybe it was hours, I couldn't tell. Time didn't seem to matter when I was frozen in my bed, trying not to make a sound. I stayed there, staring at the faces that I couldn't fully see, trying to keep my mind from racing. I don't know how much time passed before I heard footsteps, slow and heavy, coming down the hallway. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. I was too scared to make a sound, afraid that if I did, everything would change. The faces, the music, the footsteps, it all felt like a bad dream, but one I couldn't wake up from. I heard the footsteps stop outside my door. The door was cracked just a little, so I could see the shadows in the hallway. I was too afraid to move, too afraid to even blink. And then I saw her, my mom. She walked past my door, just like she always did, like everything was normal. But something wasn't right. She wasn't supposed to be walking down the hall. She wasn't supposed to be there. I opened my mouth to yell, but it was like my voice was stuck. It felt like I was trying to scream, but nothing came out. Finally, I managed to force out a shaky shout. "Mom." The word was so weak, like a whisper, but it was enough. She stopped. She turned around and flipped on the light in my room. The sudden brightness hurt my eyes, but it also made everything seem clearer. I could see the room now, the familiar walls, the bedspread with its cartoon characters, the stuffed animals piled up next to me. The faces were gone. I didn't know what happened. I couldn't explain it. They were there a second ago, staring at me, and now they were gone. Just like that. It was like they never existed. But I knew they had. I could still feel them. like they were pressing against me even though they weren't there anymore. My mom walked into the room and knelt beside me, her face full of concern. "What's wrong? What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. She was checking to see if I was okay, but I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. I didn't know how to tell her that I had seen them, that I had felt them there with me. I shook my head, still too scared to speak. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath. I kept glancing around the room, half expecting to see them again, but there was nothing. Just my room, my bed, my mom. "No one was playing any music," she said, like she was trying to reassure me. "It's okay. Maybe you just had a bad dream, sweetheart." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think it was all in my head, that it was just a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching me. For the next 2 years, I slept with all my stuffed animals piled up like a fortress around my bed. I made sure I couldn't see out, that nothing could get close enough to me without me knowing. Every night, I would tuck myself in and carefully arrange the stuffed animals, stacking them high until they reached the top of the bed frame. It was the only way I felt safe. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. It felt too strange, too unreal. It didn't make sense, and I didn't want to seem like I was crazy. So, I kept it to myself, just trying to get through the nights without seeing any more faces or hearing any more music. But sometimes, even after all that time, I still felt like something was watching me, like the world around me wasn't quite as safe as I wanted it to be. It wasn't just the darkness that scared me. It was the feeling that something was always just out of reach, hiding in the corners of the room, waiting for me to look away. And so, I learned to sleep with my back to the wall, to keep my eyes closed and pretend that nothing was there, even though I knew better. The faces never came back, not exactly like they were before. But the fear, the feeling of being watched, never really left. I guess that's the way things go sometimes. You learn to live with the things that you can't explain. You learn to sleep with the lights off, but keep a part of yourself awake, just in case. I had just turned 17 and was deep into my senior year of high school. My school schedule was a little different that year because my friend and I had signed up for summer school to get ahead, which meant we had half days. Most days, I would finish school by lunchtime, which felt amazing. It was like having the whole afternoon to myself. But sometimes it also meant being alone at home, since my parents were still at work. One afternoon, I dropped my friend off at her house after school. She lived on the other side of town, so I'd usually drive through a few familiar streets before getting to the light at the end of the road that would take me to my own neighborhood. It was a warm, quiet day in the middle of the afternoon, and the sun was shining directly down on me as I waited at the light. I remember looking around, just lost in my own thoughts, when I felt something like a sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and I glanced to my right, where I saw a guy in sunglasses in the car next to me. He was sitting in a dark sedan, a few years older than me, maybe in his 20s. At first, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't someone who often got paranoid, but the way he was staring directly at me felt odd. I smiled awkwardly and gave a small nod, thinking that was the polite thing to do. But then, not a few seconds later, I felt that unsettling gaze again. It was almost as if he was trying to get my attention. He motioned for me to pull over. My heart instantly dropped. I felt this icy chill wash over me, and my stomach twisted in a way I couldn't explain. I immediately turned my head back toward the light, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. I could feel my palms starting to sweat as I gripped the wheel. The guy didn't seem to take no for an answer. He was still trying to get my attention, gesturing again for me to pull over. I shook my head slowly, trying to keep calm, but I couldn't. I could feel the panic rising inside me like an overwhelming wave. It was like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to move but couldn't. I just stared ahead, hoping the light would turn green any second. I tried to keep my cool as the seconds stretched on forever. He didn't give up. He kept driving closer, pacing me at the same speed. His car was a dark color, maybe black, and it felt like it was closing in on me. I glanced to my right again, and he was staring at me with this strange intensity. I had no idea what his intentions were, but I knew in that moment that something was wrong. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. I wanted to pull over and scream for help, but I was alone. No one could hear me. I could feel the blood draining from my face, and I knew I needed to do something, anything, to get out of this situation. The light finally turned green, and I quickly drove through, turning left at the intersection, my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. I tried to breathe, but the tightness in my chest wouldn't go away. The guy didn't stop. He was still right there, keeping pace with me, as though he had made it his mission to stay right on my tail. Panic surged through me, and I could feel my hands starting to shake as I gripped the wheel harder. I realized I had to get away, and I had to do it fast. I wasn't going to pull into my house. That would be the worst thing to do. If I went home, I'd be completely vulnerable. My parents weren't around. It would just be me, a 17-year-old girl, and whoever this guy was who clearly wasn't taking no for an answer. I drove past my house. The familiar turn that would have led me to safety seemed like the worst choice. If I pulled in and parked in the driveway, he'd know exactly where I lived. He already knew I had gotten out of school early, so he could figure out my schedule. That realization was enough to make my stomach churn, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what else to do. The only thing I could think of was to keep driving, to make sure he lost interest. I started weaving through the streets of my neighborhood, keeping my speed steady, but not too fast. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself to focus, to not let my thoughts spiral. It wasn't easy. My mind was racing, jumping to every worst-case scenario I could think of. I was a small, petite girl, and I had no idea what this guy wanted. What if he wasn't just looking for a conversation? What if he was planning something worse? For what felt like an eternity, I drove around, trying to make turns, switching lanes, anything to shake him off. My stomach churned with each passing second as I glanced in the rearview mirror. I could still see his car behind me, keeping a steady distance, but always there, always following. I told myself over and over that I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. He had made it clear he wanted to follow me. I didn't want to go back to my house, not with him still behind me. I kept driving in circles, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe I should call the police, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. I didn't want to be that girl who freaked out over nothing. But what if something did happen? What if I needed help and didn't call for it in time? I drove for what felt like 5 minutes, weaving through the same blocks over and over again, trying to stay calm and hoping he would get tired of following me. I glanced again at the rearview mirror and finally saw it. His car was slowing down. I thought for a moment that I had somehow gotten away from him, but I couldn't be sure. My fingers tightened on the wheel as I slowed down just enough to make the next turn, keeping my eyes fixed on the road. The car behind me slowed even more, but I wasn't ready to relax yet. It wasn't until I had driven past my street again, up a few more blocks, and checked the mirror one more time that I realized he was no longer behind me. I couldn't see his car at all. My chest felt tight with a mix of relief and exhaustion. My hands were still shaking, but at least he wasn't following me anymore. I made my way back home, this time pulling into the driveway, but I didn't get out of the car immediately. I sat there for a long minute, staring at my house, trying to convince myself that I was safe. I didn't know where the guy had gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something dangerous. Even now, years later, I can still feel that same sickening sensation in the pit of my stomach when I think back to that day. At the time, I thought I was just being dramatic, that maybe I had overreacted. But the more I think about it, the more I realize how close I came to being in a terrible situation. If I hadn't made the decision to drive past my house, if I had pulled in and parked in the driveway, who knows what could have happened? Maybe nothing. Maybe he would have just been some guy who got a little too curious. Or maybe it would have turned out much worse. The truth is, I'll never know for sure. All I can say is that in that moment, I trusted my instincts. I knew something was wrong, and I acted on it. I didn't just brush it off, even when it seemed like I might be overreacting. And when I think about it now, I realize how important that decision was. I'm lucky I didn't let fear paralyze me. I'm lucky I didn't ignore the warning signs. That's the thing about situations like this. They don't always play out in dramatic, clear-cut ways. Sometimes the scariest moments come when everything seems calm on the outside. But deep down, your gut tells you something isn't right. And in that case, trusting that feeling saved me from what could have been a much darker outcome. The night we went to the old house, I didn't know it would be one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Growing up in a small southern town, everything seemed calm and peaceful, But there was always this underlying tension in the woods. Things you heard about, rumors that everyone whispered about but never dared to confirm. We all knew the old house. It was in the deep country, tucked away where nobody lived anymore, and the locals had 1,000 different stories about it. Some said it was haunted, some said there had been murders, and others just claimed it was cursed. Me and my best friend, Josh, didn't buy into any of that. We were high schoolers, full of piss and vinegar, thinking we were invincible. We wanted to show off to the girls. We were tired of the same old weekend routines, so we decided to do something different that night. Something dangerous, something that would show we were brave, maybe even a little reckless. I had heard the stories about the house since I was a kid, but never cared to see it for myself. Josh, though, had the idea to take a couple of girls from school out there. We weren't dating them, but we thought if we could get them to go, maybe they'd be impressed with our adventurous side. We didn't have the best car, a beat-up old sedan, but it did the job. We piled into the car and headed out, following the familiar roads that led to the house. I remember the air feeling thick, even though it wasn't a hot night. It felt like something was hanging over us, but none of us acknowledged it. We passed the main highway and turned down that long dirt road. It was bumpy as hell, and I could feel the wheels grinding against the rocks and dirt. The trees on both sides of the road were thick, casting long shadows that made everything feel like it was closing in on us. After what felt like forever, we parked the car at the edge of the woods. The house was up ahead, only about a half-mile walk, but it felt much further. We got out of the car, and as we stood there, staring at the woods, the night seemed quieter than usual. The air was still, and there wasn't even the sound of crickets chirping. It was like everything was holding its breath. I could barely make out the outline of the house ahead, just a shadow in the dark. It had been abandoned for years, the roof sagging, windows broken, and the wood of the porch peeling away in large, warped chunks. But we were high schoolers, and our minds were full of youthful bravado. We weren't scared of a little old house, right? Besides, it was just an abandoned place, nothing special about it, just the setting for a good story to tell at school. We walked the half-mile through the woods, the trees towering above us like silent sentinels. It was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. My flashlight flickered a bit as we got closer to the house, and I could swear the woods around us seemed unnaturally quiet. It felt like we were being watched, but again, no one said anything. We were all too eager to impress the girls. When we finally reached the house, the front door creaked open with ease. Nothing but the weight of years and neglect. The floor inside groaned under our feet as we stepped into the darkness. The place was filthy, dust covered everything, the walls were cracked, and there was a musty smell in the air. The kind of smell you get in places that have been forgotten by time. But that didn't matter. We were having fun. We were just a bunch of teenagers trying to prove something. We walked through the house, poking around and finding old furniture that was half-rotten, discarded clothes, and broken windows. Nothing unusual, just an old, decaying house. It wasn't until we ventured toward the back of the property that things started to feel off. The shed out back looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The door was hanging half open, and I remember a faint smell of something sour coming from inside. But like idiots, we thought it'd be funny to go inside. Josh tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. We pushed harder, and finally, it gave way with a loud screech. As the door opened, that's when we heard it. A female scream. It cut through the air, so sharp and filled with panic that it sent chills straight down my spine. It was so loud that it echoed through the trees, sending birds flying from their perches, startled by the sound. My first thought was that it had to be one of our friends. Maybe they had followed us and were messing with us, trying to scare us. But I quickly realized something was wrong. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It didn't sound like anyone who was messing around. It sounded like real fear. "Did you guys hear that?" I said, my voice coming out shaky, more from surprise than anything else. We stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to figure out what was going on. The scream came again, closer this time, and that's when we all ran back toward the house. We burst back into the house, looking around. There was no one there. The house, like before, was empty. The darkness inside seemed to swallow us up, and the air felt heavier. We called out, but no one answered. The screaming had stopped, but it felt like it was still echoing in my head, pounding against my skull. I remember thinking maybe we should leave, but then the scream came again, even louder this time, from somewhere outside the house. We scrambled to the door, throwing it open, and that's when it hit us. The scream wasn't just from one direction. It was all around us. It was as if the woods themselves were screaming, the sound bouncing off the trees and surrounding us from every angle. We couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was everywhere, all at once, but it sounded like a woman in extreme pain, her voice stretched thin with terror. The girls were terrified, and Josh and I, who had been trying to act tough just minutes before, were now frozen, caught in the same fear that was running through everyone else. We ran back to the car without even thinking, not saying a word to each other. All I could hear was that scream, echoing in my head as we sped away down that dirt road. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the steering wheel. We didn't say much on the drive back. I think we were all too stunned by what had just happened to speak. When we finally got back into town, we pulled over, and I couldn't help but tell Josh we needed to tell someone about it. We couldn't just leave it like that. We couldn't let it go unanswered. That's when we went to my buddy's older brother. He'd been around longer than us, had lived in the area his whole life, and probably knew the history of every house, every plot of land in the country. We told him what had happened, hoping he'd laugh it off and tell us we were just scared kids. Instead, he looked at us with a serious expression and told us something that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, that house. That place is where they found the bodies," he said. "A few years back, in the early 70s, they discovered several bodies there. Women, all of them. They never figured out who did it. Local police say it was some kind of weird ritual, but no one really knows. That house has got a bad history." We all just stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. He didn't make it sound like a ghost story or some wild tale. It was like he was stating a fact, one that carried a weight none of us had been prepared for. None of us ever went back to that house, and none of us ever admitted to messing with each other, either. We couldn't explain it. The scream we heard was real, and it was something none of us could ever forget. We didn't know if it was connected to the bodies found there, or if it was something else entirely. But whatever it was real. Sometimes I think about what happened that night. I wonder if someone else ever went out there after us. But I don't think I'll ever know the full story. All I know is that I'll never forget that scream, that terror, and I don't think I ever want to understand what caused it. I lived in that apartment for over 2 years without a single odd incident. I had roommates come and go, and I never thought much of it. It was just a regular apartment in a regular building in a regular city. Nothing ever felt off. Nothing ever felt out of place. I was living a simple, quiet life. But that changed when the new girl moved in. Her name was Sarah. She was quiet, kept to herself, and honestly, she wasn't around much on the weekends. The first time I really noticed something strange was a few weeks after she had moved in, during the fall semester, right as the Halloween season was kicking in. I love Halloween. It's one of my favorite times of year, so I started setting up for a scary movie marathon one weekend. I invited a few of my friends over, 5 or 6 of them. We gathered around the TV, popcorn in hand, ready to kick off the season with some good old-fashioned spooky fun. That night, we were all watching one of the classics, something like The Exorcist or Halloween. The room was dark, everyone was settled in, and we were all quiet, just enjoying the atmosphere of the evening. The lights from the TV flickered across our faces as we settled into the story. Then something strange happened. The door to the apartment slowly creaked open. It wasn't wide open, maybe just an inch or two. Our apartment had a pretty heavy front door, so it wasn't something that happened easily. My roommates and I, along with our guests, were all sitting there, staring at the door. I figured it was just one of the neighbors. That door had opened before, and usually someone would walk in, say hi, and join us. But nobody appeared in the doorway. No footsteps, no voices, just the open door. For a moment, it was like time stood still. Nobody moved. Nobody said anything. It was a mix of confusion and curiosity. Maybe there was a draft? It seemed impossible that the door would open on its own like that, but there was no other explanation. We got up, walked over to the door, and checked the hallway. No one was there. We all kind of brushed it off. Maybe it was just the wind, I suggested, but it still felt a little off. The apartment was on the middle level, so I doubted it was a gust of wind strong enough to move that heavy door. But then again, who knows? We decided to keep the door unlocked the next time we watched a movie, just in case. The next weekend, we gathered for another movie night. This time, we were ready. We left the door unlocked. figuring that if the same thing happened again, we'd just be prepared. We joked about it beforehand, wondering if maybe someone was just trying to mess with us. It was probably just the wind, right? We were so sure of it. We settled into the couch, got comfy, and hit play. This time, it was Paranormal Activity 3. Of course, the irony of watching a horror movie about haunted houses while waiting for something strange to happen in our own apartment wasn't lost on us. We were discussing how strange it was that the door had opened on its own last time. None of us had ever seen anything like it, and it had never happened before in the 2 years I'd lived there. You know, my boyfriend said casually, I can shrug off the door opening and no one being around, like a draft or something. But what would really freak me out is if it opened and then slammed shut. We all laughed nervously. It was just a passing comment, something to laugh about to ease the tension. But deep down, we all knew it was a weird thing to think about. A few minutes into the movie, we were all lost in the story, the apartment quiet except for the sound of our voices during occasional commentary. Then, it happened again. The doorknob turned. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, maybe pushing the door. But the door didn't just creak open. This time, it opened slowly, almost too slowly. The kind of slow motion that made everyone in the room freeze. We watched in silence as the door swung open, just like before. But this time, it didn't stop. It kept going, opening wider and wider. And then suddenly, without warning, it slammed shut. The force was enough that the entire apartment shook. The lights flickered, and the dry erase board we had hanging on the wall fell down onto the floor with a loud crash. We all jumped, hearts pounding. Some of us froze, staring at the door, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced to explain it, but there was no logical explanation. What the hell was that? Someone muttered under their breath. Everyone looked at each other, wide-eyed, waiting for someone to say something, anything that would make sense of what we just experienced. We turned on the lights immediately, and I rushed to the door. No one was there. Not a soul. I quickly ran up and down the hallway, checking the stairs, looking for any sign that someone had walked by or had been playing a prank. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No sounds of a door closing. It was like whoever, or whatever, had been messing with us had vanished. It was just too strange. I didn't know what to say. We all gathered in the living room, still shaken. Some of us were laughing nervously, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in the room. But we couldn't deny that what had just happened was beyond strange. It didn't feel like a prank or a draft. It felt like something else. Something we couldn't explain. We're sorry, I said, almost out of instinct. If someone or something is messing with us, we didn't mean it. We were just kidding around. Please leave us alone. We all agreed to keep the door locked from then on, though deep down, none of us really thought that would make a difference. Over the next week, the weirdness didn't stop. In fact, it only escalated. But the oddest thing of all happened when Sarah, the new girl who hadn't been around for any of this, started acting strange. She was walking around the apartment, muttering to herself in what sounded like a foreign language. At first, we thought maybe she was joking. But when we saw her throw holy water around the apartment, we all froze. She didn't explain what she was doing, and none of us had told her about the strange occurrences. But there she was, walking from room to room, sprinkling the water and saying something under her breath. It was like she was blessing the apartment, though I had no idea why. Something inside me told me that this wasn't just about the door. There was something else going on, something we hadn't even touched on. Maybe Sarah had felt it too, the tension, the unease that had started to settle into the apartment after the door slammed shut. It was like the apartment had become a different place overnight. After Sarah's strange ritual, things quieted down, but the unease never fully left. I finished my semester and moved out shortly after that, leaving behind the apartment and all its strange happenings. To this day, I still can't explain what happened that night or why it happened. But I know one thing for sure. There was something off about that place. Something I couldn't put into words, something that no one should ever have to experience. I don't know if it was just coincidence, or if it was something deeper. But whatever it was real enough to leave a mark on me. I still get chills every time I think about it. Sometimes I wonder if it ever happened to anyone else who lived there before or after me, and if they ever figured it out. I just hope it stays with that apartment, and it never follows me. I had been having zombie dreams for what seemed like forever. It was strange, but it had become a regular part of my sleep cycle. Night after night, I would find myself in the same apocalyptic landscape, broken buildings, the distant sound of groaning, and a constant, underlying fear that seemed to seep into my bones. There was never any real safety, never a moment where I could breathe easy. Each time, it would start the same, but it would always go in a different direction, a new fear, a new scenario to deal with. The dream was always too real, too close to what I thought the end of the world would feel like. It wasn't like the movies where you'd hear the dramatic music and know when to expect the next jump scare. No, these dreams felt gritty, raw, real. It was the kind of dream that made me wake up with a racing heart and a sense of dread that lingered for hours after I had opened my eyes. This particular night wasn't any different. I found myself standing in a destroyed city, the sky a sickly yellow, the air thick with the stench of decay. The buildings around me were half collapsed, their skeletons jagged and threatening. A car, overturned and burnt out, lay by the side of the street. The sound of distant groaning made my skin crawl, and I felt a cold sweat prickling at my skin. But I kept moving, just trying to find some sign of life, something to hold on to. Then I saw her, my mom. I hadn't seen her in the dream before, but there she was, walking toward me from a collapsed building. She was carrying a heavy backpack, her hair tangled and wild, but she looked like herself. In the chaos, she was still my mom. She stopped in front of me, the moment too surreal to process, her face tired but determined. "You've got to get this place cleaned up," she said, her voice completely out of place. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. "Mom," I said, exasperated, "we're in the middle of an apocalypse, and you're worried about chores?" But she didn't seem to hear me. Her eyes were fixed on me with an odd calmness that didn't fit the world we were in. "I've been gone for days, and the place is a mess. Can you at least make yourself useful?" she repeated, not acknowledging the zombies lurking behind me, not the sounds of moans getting louder, nor the rapid beating of my heart as the dread began to well up inside me. I wanted to scream, to argue, but my words felt like they were getting stuck in my throat. Maybe I was losing it. I didn't know anymore. All I wanted was for this nightmare to stop. I needed a break from the constant fight for survival. I told her I was going to take a nap to stall for time, hoping that when I woke up, things would be different. I didn't even know why I thought it would change anything. The dream always felt so real, like there was no escape. Before lying down, I reached into my pocket and took out an aspirin, something to calm my nerves, maybe even give me a moment of clarity. I popped it into my mouth, but as I tried to swallow, it got stuck in my throat. I tried to cough it up, but it felt like it was lodged there, just out of reach. Panic began to rise in me as I coughed harder, my throat burning. In that moment, the sound of my desperate coughing drowned out everything else. The zombies, the crumbling buildings, even the nagging voice of my mother. The only thing I could focus on was the pill caught in my throat. I remember looking at the time in the dream. It was 11:30 a.m. I could see the sunlight filtering in through the blinds, the small sliver of daylight creating a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The TV in the living room was on, casting a soft glow in the room, and for a moment, I thought I could hear the faintest sound of a news anchor talking, though I couldn't make out the words. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the exhaustion from the dream take over. My mind began to drift, and I let myself sink into the haze of sleep. I woke up with a jolt, the feeling of choking still fresh in my throat. My mouth was dry, my head foggy. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was, but when I looked around, everything looked exactly the same as it had in the dream. The sunlight was coming through the blinds. The TV in the living room was still on, casting a soft glow through the open door. My eyes darted to the clock, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw the time. It was 11:45 a.m. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wasn't in the dream anymore. I was awake, but everything around me, the sunlight, the TV, the time, was exactly as it had been in the dream. My mother wasn't supposed to be home yet. She was on a trip halfway across the country. I was alone. The panic surged up in me as I sat up quickly, looking around the room. My throat felt like it was closing up, and I started coughing again, trying desperately to clear the sensation, but it was no use. My heart raced as I looked toward the living room door. It was open, and I could see the faint glow of the TV from where I sat. But the real kicker was the sound, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Groaning. My breath hitched in my chest. Zombies. They were outside. I could hear them. It was happening for real. The dream had somehow bled into reality. I scrambled to my feet, panic overtaking every sense. I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle. I couldn't think straight. The image of my mother from the dream, her insistence on chores in the middle of the apocalypse, kept replaying in my head, taunting me, but the sound outside was far more pressing. I opened the door just a crack, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was going on outside. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. The street outside looked empty. No signs of life, no zombies in sight. The world was quiet, save for the low hum of the TV in the next room. I exhaled shakily, feeling like I'd just escaped from something, though I didn't know what. I looked back toward the living room. The TV was on, showing the news, but it was a local station, playing something harmless, like an infomercial or some old reruns. There was no emergency broadcast, no warning of impending doom. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of whether to laugh or cry. My mother wouldn't be home for another couple of days. I took another step back into the living room and sat down on the couch, my body still shaking from the adrenaline. The pill that had gotten stuck in my throat earlier, the one I had been so sure was the cause of my choking, was long gone, but the lingering sensation of something being lodged there persisted. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to ground myself in reality. It was just a dream, but it had felt so real, so uncannily real, that for a moment I'd truly believed I was trapped in it. The weight of it all hit me in waves, and I let out a long, shaky breath. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My heart still raced, but the immediate threat was gone. I looked at the clock again, just to reassure myself that it wasn't still 11:30 a.m. It was 11:50 now. The reality of my situation slowly set in. I was fine. My mom wasn't home yet, and there were no zombies outside. I was alone in my apartment, just like I was supposed to be. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the line between dream and reality had blurred somehow. Something about it all still didn't sit right. The dream felt too vivid, too real, and the way everything had mirrored itself down to the time, the TV, the sunlight, was something I couldn't ignore. It took a while, but eventually, the anxiety started to subside. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that it was just a bizarre coincidence. Just a really strange dream that had somehow crossed over into my waking life. I had gotten scared for no reason. There was no apocalypse. There were no zombies. It was just me. But as the day went on, I couldn't help but wonder. What if the boundary between the two had thinned just a little bit? What if next time I wasn't so lucky? For now, though, I took comfort in the fact that I was still in control. My mom would be home soon enough, and life would go back to normal. At least, I hoped it would. Just as I finished that thought, I caught the faintest sound outside the window, a soft groan, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I froze. Maybe I hadn't been so wrong after all. I was house-sitting for my neighbor a few years back. She had asked me to look after her house while she went on vacation, and it seemed like an easy gig. The house was fairly big, located on a quiet street at the edge of town, surrounded by trees. It was one of those places where the silence outside felt almost unnatural, the kind of stillness you notice when you're alone. The neighbor had 3 dogs, all of them friendly, and I was comfortable with the arrangement. They'd been there for years, and she trusted me with them. They weren't aggressive or anything, just regular dogs, but they always made sure to keep an eye on things. It had been a calm evening. I'd walked the dogs a few times, fed them, and settled them down for the night. They'd curled up on their beds in the living room, completely content, and I had headed up to the guest room to rest. The room was simple, just a bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto the backyard. The night outside was pitch dark, the only sound coming from the occasional wind rustling through the trees. I climbed into bed, letting out a sigh of relief. The sheets felt cool against my skin, and the softness of the pillow made it easier to drift off. It had been a long day, and I could feel my body starting to relax. My mind started to slow down, and the world outside began to fade as I started to fall asleep. But then I heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely a whisper in the air, like something was shifting downstairs. I thought it might have just been the house settling, the creaks and groans that come with old buildings at night. I tried to brush it off, closing my eyes tighter and telling myself it was nothing. The dogs were still sleeping, so that was a good sign. If there was something to worry about, they'd be alert by now, right? But then, a few seconds later, I heard it again. this time a shuffle, followed by a soft clunk. I stiffened in bed, my heart suddenly pounding. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck rise. The dogs stirred at the noise, and I heard the first low growl from one of them. The sound was low and ominous, like a warning. They were awake now, I could tell, their ears perked up in the direction of the sound. More growling followed, this time in unison, and I could hear the shuffle of their paws on the floor. My eyes snapped open, wide in the darkness, but I couldn't move. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing in, and my body wouldn't respond. My heart was racing, but I couldn't get my limbs to do anything. It was like my mind was awake, but my body was frozen. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The only thing I could do was watch the darkness around me. The dogs were up now, fully alert, barking and snarling toward the door. The growls were loud and aggressive, but it was clear they weren't just barking at the air. Something was out there. Something was in the house. I lay there, still paralyzed, my eyes locked on the bedroom door, straining to hear any sounds coming from downstairs. I could now tell that the noise was coming from the breezeway porch. It sounded like someone was moving around, scraping their feet along the wooden floor, just outside the door. I could hear the distinct sound of someone testing the doorknob, turning it slowly. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, my body stiff and unresponsive. I wanted to reach for my phone, which was just inches away on the bedside table, but I couldn't move my arms. The dogs were going crazy now, jumping up and running to the closed door. They were barking like they'd never barked before, scratching at the door with their claws. It was chaos. Their fur was bristling, their bodies tense, and the sound of their aggression filled the room. They weren't just reacting to a noise, they were reacting to something real, something dangerous. My body remained frozen in place, a spectator to the unfolding scene. I couldn't even bring myself to scream. I was all alone in the house. There was no one to help me. No neighbors close enough to hear the dogs. This house was far from town, surrounded by trees and fields, so if something was happening, no one would know. No one could come to my aid. I had no way to defend myself, and I was stuck in this bed, unable to move, unable to act. The only thing I had going for me were the dogs, and they were doing their best, but what if it wasn't enough? What if whoever was downstairs wasn't scared of them? The noise downstairs continued. I could hear the doorknob rattling again, and this time, it was followed by the unmistakable sound of someone stepping onto the porch, their weight shifting across the floor. The dogs barked louder, their voices a mix of fear and aggression. I tried to focus, to figure out what was going on, but my mind was clouded by panic. My vision seemed sharper now. The darkness didn't seem as impenetrable. I could make out the outline of the furniture in the room, the shadows shifting as the dogs continued to pace by the door. I could feel my phone within reach, but I couldn't even move my hand to grab it. I wanted to call the police, to call anyone, but my body wouldn't obey me. I closed my eyes, desperate to shut out the terror, but I could still hear everything. The dogs were going wild, their barking echoing in my ears, and the noise from downstairs was relentless. All I could do was lie there and hope. Hope that the dogs would scare whoever it was off. Hope that whoever was downstairs would hear the dogs and leave. But what if they didn't? What if they didn't care? The thought of someone being so close to me, without me being able to do anything, it was suffocating. The barking finally started to subside, but it didn't stop completely. The dogs were still alert, still on edge, but the noise from downstairs had quieted down. For a long time, there was only silence. The kind of silence that's heavy, like something is just waiting to happen. I waited, unable to move, my mind racing. I didn't hear anything more, not at all, but I was too scared to do anything. I couldn't even check my phone for fear of what I might see. The fear had drained me, and soon, despite everything, I felt my body slowly starting to relax. The paralysis was lifting, but I was still too afraid to get out of bed. I didn't trust myself to make a sound or move too quickly. If I did, I feared the worst. I finally closed my eyes, exhausted from the fear, and tried to sleep. It wasn't the sleep I wanted, but it was all I could do. I had no idea how much time had passed. All I knew was that the house was still, and the dogs had finally settled down. I prayed that whoever had been downstairs had left and would not come back. I kept my eyes shut, hoping for morning to come, hoping that I had just imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I woke up to an empty house, the dogs lying quietly on their beds. I didn't hear any strange noises or anything out of the ordinary. Everything seemed perfectly calm, like nothing had happened. But the fear still lingered inside me, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. I got up, shakily, and checked the breezeway door. It was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry, no marks on the doorknob, no footprints in the dirt. I had no idea who or what had been outside that night, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never forget that feeling of helplessness, the feeling of being completely frozen while something unknown moved through the house. It wasn't a feeling I'd ever wanted to experience again. I stayed in that house for the rest of the week, but I couldn't shake the fear. I made sure every door and window was locked every night, but the sense of unease never really left. A few weeks later, my neighbor returned. She was happy to see the dogs had been well cared for, and she never mentioned anything out of the ordinary. I didn't bring it up either, because I didn't know how to explain the terror I'd felt. Maybe I'll never know who or what was really there that night, but I've never house sat for her again. And when I walk past her house, I still wonder if that night was just a fluke, or if someone or something was really out there waiting. It had always been my home, the house I grew up in. The same room, the same view from my window, the same smells and creaks in the floorboards. I'm 19 now, a biology major at college, and I still live in that house. Sometimes, though, I wonder if it's really just a house. It started early, or at least, that's what my parents have told me. I was a baby, barely old enough to form memories, but they always talk about how I used to cry in my crib, just like any other baby. The difference was, before they even got a chance to pick me up and calm me down, I'd stop. Suddenly, I'd be calm, even smiling, as if nothing had happened at all. They thought it was strange, but babies are unpredictable, right? But it didn't stop there. When I was about 2 years old, I started talking more. It was around that time, according to my mother, that I said something that still gives her chills. She says I looked up at her one evening, while we were sitting in my room, and casually told her, "Don't worry, the man in the rocking chair keeps me safe." I had never seen a man in the rocking chair, but my grandfather had sat in that very chair every day until he passed away from a heart attack. I had no memory of him, but the chair remained in my room, and I would sit in it sometimes, playing with my toys. It was just a chair to me, but apparently, I had some connection to it that even I couldn't explain. My parents were unnerved, but chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Even now, when I think back to those days, I wonder if it was more than just my imagination. As I grew older, I noticed little things happening around the house. It was never anything overt, nothing that screamed ghost, or anything like that. But there were moments that didn't sit right with me, and I'd always wonder if I was just imagining things. I remember my father, who was always the skeptic of the family, always mentioning how he felt like someone was watching him, especially when he was working outside. He'd be out cutting the grass, and suddenly he'd freeze, his eyes darting to the sides, like he'd heard something or saw something move out of the corner of his eye. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, maybe the heat of the summer getting to him. But it happened more than once. Even though he tried to brush it off, there were times when he would turn around, looking visibly startled, his face pale. I also started to notice it more when I was alone, especially at night. My room was always quiet, too quiet sometimes, but I was used to it. I always had trouble sleeping, so I'd lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with random thoughts. That one night, though, when I was about 7 years old, things were different. I had a plastic Godzilla toy, the kind with a button on its chest that made the torso rotate and the head roar when pressed. I remember it being one of my favorite toys, and I always placed it on top of my dresser at the far end of the room when I went to bed. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position. At some point, I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of something moving, almost like a soft click. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing. But then, the Godzilla toy's roar echoed through the room. My heart skipped a beat. It was loud, sudden, and out of place. The toy had been sitting upright, motionless, and the button wasn't pressed. But there it was, roaring from the other side of the room, and I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't even scream. My eyes were locked on the toy, and all I could do was lay there, staring at it. After what felt like forever, it stopped. The room was dead silent again, but the fear lingered. I spent the rest of the night wide-eyed, too scared to move. That wasn't the only strange occurrence in the house. My dad has a story of his own. He's always been the pragmatic one. never one to entertain the idea of ghosts or anything supernatural. But even he saw something he couldn't explain. He swears he saw a woman in a red dress walking down the hallway toward his bedroom. He told me about it one night, his voice serious, but I could tell he was just as confused as I was. "I thought it was your mom," he said, "but when I looked again, there was no one there." He didn't seem frightened, but the confusion in his voice made it clear that something didn't add up. He brushed it off, but I think a part of him still wonders about it, even now. Then came the night about a month ago, the most recent and possibly the most unsettling experience I've had. I had just gotten home from work around 2 a.m., tired and ready to collapse into bed. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the windows. I took the stairs up to my room, moving quietly so I wouldn't wake anyone. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something strange. A figure was coming down toward me. I froze for a moment, thinking it was my sister. She had a habit of staying up late, so it wasn't unusual for her to be awake at this hour. I stepped aside, clearing the way, and as the figure got closer, I said, "Hey, you coming up too?" But as the figure reached me, it did something that made my blood run cold. It didn't stop. It didn't respond. It just dissipated. There was no sound, no motion, nothing to explain it. The figure, which had looked like my sister, was suddenly gone. Just gone. The air felt heavy, and for a split second, I thought I had just imagined it. But I hadn't. It had felt too real, like someone had been walking toward me, only for them to fade into nothing at the last moment. I stood there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what to think. I had hoped it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I never told anyone about that last experience, not right away. I kept it to myself, thinking I might have been just exhausted or maybe a little too paranoid. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed impossible to explain. The air had felt different when it happened, like a shift in the atmosphere, and that's not something you just ignore. It was almost like something was trying to make contact, or at least get my attention. As the days passed, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. Sometimes, when I was alone in my room, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked, there was nothing there. It was like something was there, but just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling, even during the day. And it wasn't just me. My parents started mentioning little things too. The odd creak of the floorboards when no one was walking. The soft murmur of voices when no one was speaking. The sense that, somewhere in the house, someone else was there, watching, waiting. I still live in that house. I'm still in the same room, staring at the same walls that I've known my whole life. And while I try to tell myself that it's just my imagination, that it's all in my head, part of me knows that something's off. It's not just a house. It never was. And even though I can't explain it, I don't think I want to. Maybe there's something to it, something beyond what I can see or understand. Or maybe it's just that after all these years, I've become a part of it. Just like the chair, just like the house. Maybe it's always been here, and always will be. Either way, I don't think I'll ever feel completely alone in this house again.